Chapter 65. Chang'an City must be very lively tonight. After a night of fighting, Ning Ke was very tired, but the blood and knives in the rainy night made him a little excited. He imagined what was happening in each of the markets, guessed Xiao Xiaoshu's trump card, and speculated where he would go the next day. He tossed and turned, unable to fall asleep. He kicked Sang Sang awake through the thin quilt. They talked about these things for a while, but still couldn't understand. Sang Sang saw that he looked haggard but couldn't fall asleep. She thought for a while, put on an unlined robe, and brought back a jar of liquor. The two sat on opposite sides of the bed and drank. As usual, most of the liquor went into Sang Sang's stomach. Ning Ke couldn't overcome the alcohol after a few sips and finally fell asleep. The next morning, the spring rain that had lingered for several days suddenly stopped. The beautiful sun came out from behind the rain clouds without a greeting and shone on the birds jumping in the treetops. A horse carriage quietly stopped at the door of the old brush pen shop. A young man who looked like a manservant got off the carriage. He pushed open the half-closed wooden door without a greeting and looked at the master and servant who had just woken up. He raised his chin slightly and said coldly, "Let's go." This was probably the person Xiao Xiaoshu had said would come to pick him up. Ning Ke looked at the manservant and noticed that the man's eyes and brows were peaceful, but there was a hint of arrogance in them. From the man's flat Adam's apple and his slightly different standing posture, he should be one of the eunuchs in the palace. Last night, Ning Ke knew that Xiao Xiaoshu's backer was in the palace. Today, a little eunuch came to pick him up. Naturally, Ning Ke wasn't too surprised. He was just thinking about whether he should give him a red packet, and how big it should be. In his impression of the novels, the emperor was not anxious, but the eunuchs were anxious. It meant that the emperor was easy to provoke, but the eunuchs were not. In the stories, whenever the protagonist met a eunuch, no matter if the eunuch was a steward or a servant, he would choose an opportunity to hand over a few thin banknotes or even a piece of jade. When he read those stories, the biggest question he had was, where did the protagonists get so many pieces of jade? Note, Ning Ke raised his eyebrows and glanced at Sang Sang, asking her if she should prepare something with his eyes. Sang Sang had always been a stingy girl. She was slightly startled and turned her head away, pretending that she did not understand what he meant. Her young master was not a generous person. After thinking for a while, she decided that she might as well pretend to be ignorant and save some money. The little eunuch held his hands behind his back and casually looked around the shop. Like an old man, he nodded and said in a clear voice, "I heard that there are some good characters in this alley. Today I came to take a look, and it is indeed not bad. There are nobles in the palace who want to see your writing. Quickly wash up and come with me." Ning Ke thought that this was a good excuse. He looked at his clothes and bowed to the young eunuch with hands folded in front. He said with a smile, "This is how I usually dress. How can a poor scholar dress up like a flower?" He was a little worried that the eunuch would make things difficult for him because he did not receive the red envelope. He did not expect that the eunuch did not care. Instead, he smiled and seemed to like his way of talking. He nodded at him and walked out of the shop. In the somewhat cramped carriage, the little eunuch closed his eyes and rested all the way. Judging from his behavior at Lin 47th Street, he did not seem to have any opinions about Ning Ke, nor did he disdain to talk to him. He was just habitually cautious outside the palace. Ning Ke, on the contrary, felt that it was so quiet. He lifted a corner of the curtain and looked at the scenery along the street. Under the bright sunshine, the people of Chang'an walked in the marketplace with smiles on their faces. The business of the breakfast shops was booming. From time to time, he could hear people calling for their friends. There was no trace of the bloody fight in Jianghu last night. After an unknown amount of time, 2 rows of willow trees blocked their line of sight. A comfortable shadow covered the entire carriage and the stone path that the carriage passed through. The shadow did not come from the willow trees, but from the royal palace behind the willow trees and the moat. The Tang Empire was the most powerful country in the world. Chang'an City was the most magnificent city in the world. The imperial palace of the Tang Empire could be described as the most magnificent palace in the world. It might not be appropriate to use the word magnificent to describe the imperial palace. However, the imperial palace of the Tang Empire had inherited the grandeur of the Tang people for thousands of years. The red walls were thick and the yellow eaves were like swords. The atmosphere was grand and solemn. It did not look like a romantic and noble place where the 3 palaces, 6 courtyards, and 72 concubines gathered in the morning. Instead, it looked more like an impregnable pass standing in the center of the Tang Empire. Ning Ke looked up at the majestic imperial palace. His gaze followed the extremely high red walls to the Tang Empire's Yulin Forest army soldiers who looked like black dots on the city wall. His expression was calm, but he was silently admiring it. It was a pity that the carriage did not enter through the Vermilion Bird main gate. Instead, it went around the moat and then drove in through a very inconspicuous side gate. The carriage entered the imperial palace and drove slowly on the narrow road. It did not know how many turns it took. His line of sight was completely blocked by the high walls and eaves beside the carriage. He could only see the sky that was cut into pieces by the eaves. He did not have the chance to see the entire imperial palace. He only felt that the palace inside was extremely high. In the distance, they could see a blue lake. The young eunuch led Ning Ke down the carriage and started walking. The two walked along the dense sea of bamboo by the lake. After a few minutes, they passed through a wide rain corridor supported by red pillars and stopped in front of a row of small inconspicuous halls. What made Ning Ke feel a little confused and even vigilant was that he did not see any bodyguards on such a long journey. He did not even see a eunuch or palace maid. The young eunuch turned his head and looked at him expressionlessly. He said, "This is the imperial study. I can only bring you up to here. You can wait here. Someone will bring you out of the palace after you have seen them." Ning Ke did not care much. He was looking at the strange flowers and trees in front of the hall with great interest. He looked at the flower boats on the lake that were covered by weeping willows in the distance. He was just about to see if he could see a few beautiful palace maids when he suddenly heard the words, "Imperial study." His body could not help but slightly stiffen. He turned around and looked at the inconspicuous rooms behind him in shock. A man's most private place was not the bedroom, but the study. In the snowy morning of winter, he could read forbidden books in the study. In the summer dusk, he could watch erotic movies naked in the study. In the warm afternoon of spring, he could write ambiguous love letters in the study. In the late night of autumn, he could pull his red sleeves and knead them in his arms. There were no old women to disturb him here. There were no children to play with. All private and happy things could be done openly with the fragrance of books. No one would disturb him. The emperor was also a man. The imperial study was naturally his most private place. In history, many important events and dirty things happened in the imperial study. If one was not the emperor's most trusted confidant or a confidant that he was prepared to give absolute trust to, he was absolutely not qualified to enter the imperial study. Wu Zetian entered the imperial study, Zhang Juzheng entered the imperial study, Wei Zhongxian entered the imperial study, Wei Xiaobao entered the imperial study. Ning Ke stared blankly at the closed door of the imperial study and thought with emotion. How many great women and former eunuchs and powerful officials had become successful because they entered this small study? He did not expect that such an opportunity would fall on his head today. Last night, he guessed that Chao Xiaoshu's backer was someone in the palace, and that person in the palace was very likely His Majesty himself. However, guessing and proving it were two different things. The youth who had been homeless and miserable for the past 16 years suddenly found that he seemed to have the opportunity to rise to the top in a single step. He could not help but feel a little shocked. He finally understood that what Chao Xiaoshu said last night was truer than gold and silver. This was really the thickest thigh in the world. No one will come here in half an hour. If anyone asks, just answer as I taught you. Say that Lu Ji brought you into the palace. Full of emotion, Ning Ke did not notice that the little eunuch had quietly left. When he woke up, he found that there was no one around the imperial study. He was in a strange and strict palace with no one around him. The cool and pleasant environment suddenly became a little gloomy. Even someone as bold as him could not help but feel a little uncomfortable. He stood in front of the corridor and waited for a moment. Suddenly, he thought that he should go in first. He and Sang Sang had been amazed for a long time when they entered Chang and city like country bumpkins. Moreover, this was the palace. He did not understand the rules at all. He just thought this way according to common sense, so he did as he said. He gently coughed twice and pretended to bow to the imperial study. Then he pushed the door open and walked in. The so-called natural course was all fake. Ning Ke just wanted to go in. Over the years, the most important part of his life, besides meditation and martial arts, was calligraphy. Today, he had a rare opportunity to enter the imperial study. Of course, he was eager to see this study, which was rumored to have countless famous calligraphies. This desire was so strong that he had completely forgotten the so-called rules. Pushing open the door and entering, the first thing that entered his eyes was an extremely tall row of bookshelves leaning against the wall. The bookshelves were horizontal and vertical, and their style was extremely ordinary and simple. However, the wood used was the extremely valuable Dongmu Wangwali. The bookshelves were densely packed with all kinds of books, and the arrangement was uneven. However, they were all extremely valuable and unique treasures. There were a few sheets of writing paper on the desk. A brush was placed on the inkstone like a thin raft in a clear pool, immersed in the ink, and several other brushes were placed messily on the brush rack. The paper was Xianzhou bud paper, the brush was Hengdian pure brush, the ink was Qinzhou pine ink, and the inkstone was Huangzhou mud inkstone. None of them were eye-catching, but all of them were precious tributes. If these brushes, ink, paper, and inkstone could be taken back to Lin 47th Street and sold, how much could they be sold for? Ning Ke looked around in a daze, and for no reason, such a ridiculous idea came into his mind. Then his eyes were attracted by the calligraphy hanging on the 3 white walls. Looking at these calligraphy that were hard to find in the world, he was shocked beyond words. He slowly moved his feet, and his eyes fell on the original works of famous calligraphies, as well as the inscriptions and seals. His right hand subconsciously drew in the air and began to copy them. His face was full of praise and joy. He went to the desk and looked at the 5 thick characters on the paper. He could not help but frown and murmured, "His Majesty's appreciation is very high, but this calligraphy is really not good." Chapter 66. On the slightly granular Xianzhou bud paper, the ink was dripping and unruly, and 5 words were written: "The fish leaps into the sea." Looking at the frame of the ink scroll, there should have been another sentence on the paper, but for some reason, the writer stopped after writing these 5 words. The middle section of the last hook of the word "sea" was left blank, faintly revealing a hint of unwillingness. These 5 words were written in a strict and elegant manner. It would have been good if written by an ordinary person, but in Ning Ke's eyes, it did not look impressive at all. Especially since he had just read the authentic works of the predecessors, he naturally felt that these 5 words, "fish leaping across the sea," were quite terrible. Even if he guessed that these words were written by His Majesty, it would not change his impression. Thinking that he entered the palace today under the name of a calligrapher, Ning Ke's heart slightly moved. He secretly thought that if his calligraphy caught the eye of His Majesty in the future, then he would have a meteoric rise. It would not be bad to become an unpopular but extremely glorious court official. Just as he was thinking about this, he suddenly heard an angry voice from afar behind the imperial study. The voice was thick and powerful, but it seemed especially violent. However, because it was too far away, he could only hear the most angry words of the person who scolded him. "Idiot! Idiot! A bunch of idiots!" The 2 words, "idiot," were scolded by that person. It was sonorous and powerful like a war drum, and it was as clear as hitting a plate. Ning Ke stood in the imperial study in a daze, listening to the word "idiot" that seemed to come from beyond the sky. Gradually, he could not help but be fascinated by it. He felt a great sense of familiarity in his heart. He secretly wondered which steward was scolding idiots in such a coquettish manner. The Tang Imperial Palace was such a solemn place. Even the most powerful eunuch steward dared not scold people in such a loud voice, not to mention that the voice of idiot came from the discussion hall. Ning Ke was not clear about the distribution of the buildings in the palace. Of course, he did not know that the area around the imperial study had always been heavily guarded. The discussion hall happened to be very close to the imperial study, so he could hear countless words of idiot, but others could not. Inside the palace of council, there were coiled dragons on the jade pillars, and the golden curtains were embroidered with heavenly made scattering flowers. On the left side of the imperial couch sat a beautiful woman dressed in palace attire. She was about 30 years old, with beautiful eyebrows and eyes. She looked charming and gentle, and her slightly thick lips were tightly pursed, which added a hint of firmness. Looking at her head ornament and phoenix dress, she was the Queen of Tang. On the right side of the imperial couch sat a 16 or 17-year-old girl. Her eyes were slightly drooping and she was using her slender fingers to serve tea. Her beautiful face, coupled with her tranquil expression, made her look extremely graceful. Her slightly tanned cheeks, which had been tanned from running on the grasslands, had now returned to fair in less than 10 days. She was the fourth princess of the Tang Empire, Liu. Between the empress and the princess, there was a middle-aged man sitting on the couch. His black hair was casually tied behind his head, and he wore an extremely large robe. His voice was gentle, powerful, and unquestionable. Occasionally, when he said those two words, his voice would jump up like a cloud hitting a mountain, and thunder would ring through the palace. On the ground in front of the couch, there were more than a dozen officials kneeling. Their heads were deeply buried, and their bodies were trembling slightly, looking particularly ashamed and frightened. The prince and the two old ministers who were qualified to sit also looked extremely ugly. The Tang Empire had never paid much attention to secular rules. Even in the daily discussions and interactions between the emperor and his ministers, the ministers often did not need to kneel and kowtow, but only needed to make a deep bow. This was especially so for the current emperor, who was known for his benevolence. Normally, when the emperor and his ministers met in the discussion hall, His Majesty would even wave away the deep bow with a wave of his hand. However, today, the benevolent emperor suddenly burst into a thunderous rage. The ministers of the Tang Empire finally realized that His Majesty did not allow them to kneel usually because he did not like it. When he was unhappy, the discussion hall became terrifying. The middle-aged man on the couch was naturally the emperor of the Tang Empire, the person with the greatest secular power in the Haotian world. He looked at the ministers kneeling on the cold golden bricks in front of him, and his calm but mocking gaze slowly swept across their faces. The governor of the army, the protector general, the Huaihua general, these were all the bigwigs of the military ministry, the minister of the right, the assistant minister of the central department, the old and young masters of the Ministry of Revenue, the governor of the capital, the assistant minister of the Yellow Gate, the two statues in Chang'an, his younger brother sitting in the chair, and those old fellows. How much did they know about this matter? How can a gang take over the river transport business and move grain from the warehouse? You are all high-ranking officials in the imperial court, and a word from the steward of the mansion would make many people tremble in fear. How dare Cao Shaoshu not listen to you? Are you really a bunch of idiots? Have you never thought of the reason? The emperor of the Tang Empire looked at his ministers as if he was looking at a group of bastards. His right hand touched the back of his head that was faintly aching, and he even had the urge to laugh out loud because of anger and disappointment. He stared at the crowd, slammed the table, and scolded, "You want to know who is the backer of the #1 gang in Chang'an? Now you know, and you know it's me. Don't you think you've become the biggest idiot in the world? The Fish Dragon Gang. The Fish Dragon Gang. You are all well-educated people who are used to seeing the wind and rain, and yet none of you have thought of the 4 words, Fish Dragon Gang? If it wasn't my intention, who in Chang'an would dare to use this name as a gang name? I am very disappointed in you, not because you ignore the law and oppress the people, but because you are stupid. Idiots. You haven't understood such a simple thing after so many years. If you are not idiots, then who are you? The chaotic fight in Chang'an on a rainy spring night had finally succeeded in forcing Cao Shaoshu to use his trump card. However, as soon as this trump card was revealed, the wind and rain disappeared without a trace, because this trump card was too powerful. It was so powerful that it could define everyone as an idiot with just one sentence, and then start to settle accounts later. The ministers kneeling in the hall felt so wronged and sad that they didn't know what to say. They silently thought that for so many years, no one had found any connection between the fish dragon gang and the palace. Besides, the emperor was the noble emperor, while the fish dragon gang was just a small carp in the gutter of Chang'an. Their statuses were thousands of miles apart, and they didn't exist in the same world at all. Who would have thought that there was a connection between them? It was like an advisor in the county government went to make things difficult for a small helper in the kitchen, and in the end, the advisor found out that the helper was under the protection of the Minister of Revenue. But the problem was, how could a guy who was under the protection of the Minister of Revenue be a small helper in the county government's kitchen? If Cao Shaoshu was an old acquaintance that your Majesty met in the common people, and the two of them had a friendship, then why had he been soaking in the stinky gutter of Jianghu all these years? As long as your Majesty said the word, where in the empire couldn't find a 4th or 5th rank official post for him? This was not because the princes and ministers were idiots, it was purely because your Majesty was playing with us as idiots. Kneeling on the cold golden bricks and sitting restlessly on the chairs, the Tang nobles and ministers were all full of complaints, but no one dared to jump out and argue with the one on the dragon throne at this time. For these big shots of the empire, winning over or subduing Spring Breeze Pavilion Old Chow was a small matter, but they had encountered the biggest mountain in the world, so they knew that they were bound to be unlucky. More importantly, their subordinates and deputies were responsible for the specific handling of these matters, and they used the power of the imperial court and even the military, which had already touched the bottom line of His Majesty. How should this matter be resolved? Chapter 67. Xing Qingyu, the Minister of Revenue, had never felt that the golden bricks of the conference hall were so hard. In fact, he rarely knelt except during the Grand Court Conference, let alone for such a long time. He secretly wiped away the cold sweat on his forehead and felt that his spine was on the verge of breaking. In order to find some kind of psychological comfort, he sneaked a glance to the side and saw the dejected faces of the military officials. Sure enough, he felt a lot more comforted. Two emotions, luck and fear, rose in his heart. The logistics office wanted the land on Lin 47th Street. It seemed to be the main cause of this conflict, but it was just a small prelude. Although I knew about it, I never intervened. However, the military ministry was deeply involved this time. I heard that more than 20 elites of the Yulin Royal Guards were killed on that rainy night, and a psyche master in the see-through state lost his life. How could His Majesty let you off so easily under such circumstances? The mocking and angry words of the middle-aged man on the throne continued to ring out, and finally turned into a sigh of exasperation. I created such a gang back then and acted as the eyes and ears of the people for the empire. It took me a lot of effort to hide it for more than 10 years, but in the end, I was forced into the open by you guys just because of some petty benefits. From then on, I can no longer play the role I want. Is there anything wrong with me calling you idiots? His Majesty sighed, and the officials sighed. At this time, they all knew that the so-called Fish Dragon Gang was a product of His Majesty's whim when he was still the Crown Prince. They all silently thought that it was just his plaything. How could there be so much to say? At this moment, His Majesty's voice became low and cold, and all the mockery disappeared. He stared at the officials and asked sharply, "The question is, are you really just doing it for those petty interests? I know what you want to do, but how can my wife and daughter be chosen by you idiots who are courting death? You stir up trouble in Chang'an, and in the name of the Empress and the Princess, but you certainly don't know that my Empress has always been very clear about the relationship between the small gang and the palace, and you, was even carried to the Spring Breeze Pavilion by me to play when she was young." At this point in the lecture, the officials in the hall could no longer bear the wave after wave of absurd and cold blows. The legs of the Huaihua general and the Huangmen assistant minister turned soft at the same time. They went from kneeling to sitting up in fear. The emperor looked at the two of them coldly and said, "The duty of the Tang Empire's soldiers is to protect the land and open up new frontiers, not to help gangs fight for territory. What I despise the most is that you didn't even win. In that case, you go to Chongning City and train the soldiers for me. Train them for 3 to 5 years. When you are sure that your soldiers can defeat the gangs in Chongning City, then come back." Chongning City was located in the southwest of the empire. It was hot in summer and cold in winter. There were many forests and poisonous creatures in the mountains. It had always been regarded as a dangerous place by the Tang Empire's officials. As for defeating the gangs in Chongning City for 3 to 5 years, everything was said by His Majesty. If he said that you didn't win, then you didn't win. Then how would you come back? With a few words, a big shot of the military ministry was assigned to a miserable place, and it was very likely that he would never be able to return to the central command. It was a harsh punishment. The officials in the hall became more and more frightened. But when the protector heard that his head was still on his neck, he did not hesitate to heavily kowtow twice and repeatedly thank the emperor. His Majesty was a little tired after scolding them dozens of times today. Looking at these officials who did not dare to talk back, he also felt a little tired. He took a cup of tea from Li Yu and drank 2 sips, then waved his hand to signal. Eunuch Lin flashed out from the side of the imperial couch and slowly opened the bright yellow imperial edict with his skinny hands. He read expressionlessly, "In the 13th year of the Tianqi era, Xing Qingyu, the Minister of Revenue, was ordered to return home to meditate and reflect for 3 months. I will wait for your confession." The so-called defense memorial was just an excuse. His Majesty was giving face to the ministers in the imperial court by letting him take the initiative to resign and return to his hometown. Xing Qingyu kowtowed in response. Thinking that his official career had been cut short because of such a trivial matter because of a gang in Chongning, his hands that were supporting his body could not help but tremble. As Eunuch Lin read the imperial edict expressionlessly, an assistant minister was imprisoned, and the warehouse of the logistics department of the Ministry of Revenue was cleaned from top to bottom. Several officials of the Chongning local government were dismissed on the spot, the capital governor was exiled to Tianshui with a gloomy expression, and the assistant minister of the eunuch was handed over to the Department of Justice for trial. The military ministry suffered the heaviest blow. General Xiaohou angrily wrote a letter asking the military ministry to explain to him why his capable subordinate Zhuai was murdered by the military ministry. So His Majesty beheaded 7 people in the military ministry to explain to the important general far away at the border, or rather, to Cao Shaoshu. In the process of reading the imperial edict and demoting the officials involved, His Majesty remained silent and did not say a word, no matter whether the officials kowtowed and bled, cried out for their innocence, or shed tears of gratitude. But when the minister of the Ministry of Personnel asked for opinions on the replacement of the capital governor, he frowned and thought of a name. Chongning Local Government Judicial Military Advisor. Who is that Shengguan? Shengguan Yuyang. The minister of the Ministry of Personnel said. He glanced at His Majesty's expression and guessed what he was thinking. He coughed twice and continued, "This official has a good evaluation and was a proper imperial examination student. But because of his unsightly appearance, I want an official who can govern the people, not a beauty." The emperor impatiently waved his hand and said, "Then it is this person." The officials in the Palace of Council were either exiled or retreated. Gradually, only the most important figures were left. The prince, who had been sitting quietly in the chair like a statue, could no longer sit still. He stood up from the chair and walked to the bed. He lifted the front lapel of his royal robe and knelt down with a thud. The royal family of the Tang Empire, or rather, the current emperor, had always attached great importance to family ties. Infighting and strife were rarely seen in the royal palace. The emperor trusted the prince, his only brother, and would never make him lose face in front of the officials. However, the prince knew that the so-called face had to be fought for. If he still wanted to keep his face today, then his brother would lose face. As expected, His Majesty did not ask him to stand up today. Instead, he looked down at his brother's face coldly and observed whether the pain between his brother's eyebrows was real or not. After a long time, under the persuasion of the Empress, His Majesty calmed down a little and said in a cold voice, "Raise your head and look at me." The prince slowly raised his head and looked directly at the soul-stirring eyes on the bed. "Is Wang Jinglu your Minister of Offerings?" "Yes." "Do you think it's a pity that I let him serve in the army?" "I dare not. I let him train with Su Shi. He must have his own benefits." Su Shi was the most famous general in the Tang Empire. Wang Jinglu was known as a genius in cultivation. Under the command of the iron-blooded general, Wang Jinglu's temperament would definitely improve. The prince was slightly startled and quickly thanked the emperor. "There is no need to thank me. At least, you cannot thank me on his behalf." The emperor looked at his brother and said in a cold voice, "It is not easy for the Tang Empire to produce a talent, so I want to protect him. But the talents of the Tang Empire can only serve the Tang Empire. They cannot become your private property. Do you understand?" The words hit his heart. The prince suddenly felt his heart tighten. Sweat seeped out of his back and instantly soaked his royal robe. He did not know how to respond. He could only lower his head again and beg for forgiveness in a humble manner. "These years, I have rewarded you with many good things. Recently, the palace treasury has been a little tight. You should make some contributions. I will remember your kindness." "I dare not." "Is there anything in this world that you dare not do?" The emperor smiled and said, "As a prince, you actually allowed your steward to open a brothel. If it were not for the fact that Mistress Jian and the empress were close friends in the early years, I don't know how many more years I would have been kept in the dark by you." It was not a sneer. There was no hidden meaning in the words, but the prince felt the invisible pressure suddenly increased. The speed of sweat on his back became faster and faster. He nervously waited for the emperor's next edict, but after waiting for a long time, he did not hear it. He could not help but feel suspicious. The smile on the emperor's face gradually disappeared. He looked at him calmly and said, "This time, I am not willing to punish you heavily. It is not because of anything else, but because the person who watched over the House of Red Sleeves for your steward said something for you that he is absolutely loyal to me." The prince suddenly realized that after Cao Xiaoshu went to the House of Red Sleeves that day, the steward had told him about Cui Delu's report. Although he believed that he was loyal to the man on the dragon throne, he did not want his subordinates to say too much. He always felt that it was a little embarrassing. Thinking about it today, it was all thanks to the words of the steward. Since the first year of Tianqi era, the weather in the Tang Empire had been smooth. The court and the people were in harmony. There were only two relatively big cases. One was the Imperial Astronomer incident, and the other was the recent case, which was called the Spring Breeze Pavilion case. In the Spring Breeze Pavilion case, on the surface, more than a dozen officials were demoted and 7 people in the military ministry were beheaded. But secretly, some key people in key positions were purged in advance. However, because those positions were related to the safety of the imperial palace and had a bad influence, the news was tightly blocked. On that rainy spring night, Deputy General Chao Ning of the Yulin Royal Guards welcomed Eunuch Lin in the palace and also welcomed his own death. Chang III, Chang Siwei, Fei 6 and Fei Jingwei, who were previously prisoners, directly beheaded them in the rain with the imperial edict written by the emperor. Then they reported that they died suddenly of illness. Also on that rainy spring night, Lu Si, the 5th Lu of the Fish Dragon Gang, rode his horse and spear and killed Chu Ren, the deputy commander of the Valiant Cavalry Battalion, on the playground of the Valiant Cavalry Battalion. He took revenge for being set up 10 years ago and also completed the mission given by the emperor. It was also after this rainy spring night that many people in the upper class of the Tang Empire knew the name of Spring Breeze Pavilion Old Chow. Or it could be said that they began to pay attention to this name. Those people also wanted to know who the masked teenager of the Yueluan kingdom beside him was, but they had no way to ask. Qiao Shaoshu stood by the lake in the imperial garden, quietly looking at the big lake called Leaving Sea. His green robe swayed slightly in the lake wind. When eunuchs and palace maids passed by him, they would humbly step aside to avoid him. Now that people already knew who he was and what kind of future he would have, they did not hide the envy, curiosity, and even admiration in their eyes. Qiao Shaoshu seemed to feel nothing. There was no coldness on his face when he killed the people last night, nor the nervousness that a person from Jianghu should have after entering the imperial palace. He looked relaxed and calm. A golden carp jumped up from the Leaving Sea, jumped over the dragon gate that the palace maids weaved with garlands, and then happily fell back into the water. In many people's eyes, Qiao Shaoshu was like a fish jumping into the sea today in Chang'an City. He would be famous and would rise rapidly. But he did not think so. Chapter 68. The biggest turbulence in the Tang Tianqi era was taking place in the Palace of Council. Many officials in various departments were guessing the fate of themselves and their superiors. The lad in the imperial study was looking around excitedly. Qiao Shaoshu, who was standing somewhere in the imperial garden, acted as if he had nothing to do with these things. He stood silently by the shore of the big lake called Lehai, smiling as he watched the colorful carps leap out of the water and over the dragon gate. Then, they happily fell back into the lake, wagging their tails as they begged for food. Occasionally, he would sigh. More than 10 years ago, he was a young scholar who entered the capital city to take the entrance exam to the academy but was brought into Chang'an by the current emperor. More than 10 years later, he was a green-robed wanderer who stood in the Chang'an night after beheading countless people. Standing by the lake, he thought about the past and the road ahead of him. Naturally, he had a different feeling in his heart. He did not feel that the road to success was attractive, but only wanted to return to the old days when he studied hard day and night and focused on Taoism. A soft ring broke the silence by the lake. The beautiful young princess slowly walked over with 2 palace maids. Li Yu's gaze fell on the middle-aged man's green robe, which had been washed a little white. She smiled and half-squatted, saying softly, "Greetings, Uncle Qiao." The 4th princess of the Tang dynasty, Li Yu, was doted on by the emperor and admired by the people. Even when she met the prince, she would only call him uncle. How could she call a man so intimately? "I dare not." Qiao Shaoshu moved sideways to give way, repeatedly saying that he did not dare. His face was full of fear. However, his body moved slightly, and the wind on the lake moved the corner of his green robe. There was no sense of fear at all, only a sense of alienation and vigilance that kept people thousands of miles away from him. Seeing Qiao Shaoshu's reaction, Li Yu's hands on her waist stiffened slightly. The 2 palace maids behind her turned pale. However, before they could do anything, Li Yu smiled and answered, "Speaking of which, when my father asked the guards to carry me out of the palace to play, I saw you a few times in the gambling house. However, I was too young at that time and gradually forgot that Uncle Qiao had carried your niece before. There is no need to treat me like an outsider today. Your Highness's words really frighten me. How could I dare to call myself the princess's elder?" Qiao Shaoshu responded with a smile. The lake water reflected the sunlight and fell on his handsome face. There was no trace of deliberate humility. He was just carefully guarding the status of a monarch and a subject, not daring to take a step forward. Li Yu had repeatedly expressed her goodwill, but Qiao Shaoshu had repeatedly rejected her. The atmosphere by the lake suddenly became a little tense and even depressing. Li Yu quietly looked at the middle-aged man's face and thought of the anger her father had shown since last night. She was more and more certain that this man was extremely important in her father's heart. She waved her hand to stop the old maidservants beside her from whispering and continued with a smile, "I brought back some barbarian guards from the grassland. I heard that someone asked them about something a few days ago. That person's surname is Chen, and he seems to be your brother?" I, Xiao Shu said, "Chen, ch. He is, Hearing this answer, Li Yu smiled. She shifted her gaze to the sea-like surface of the lake and looked at the lotus leaves disturbed by the swimming fish. She asked, "Is that lad useful?" "Your Highness, I did not use him. I only asked him to help me." Qiao Shaoshu answered, "It's working together, not using him." "If it's working together, then he is also your brother?" Li Yu turned her head and asked with her brows slightly furrowed. Qiao Shaoshu thought of the fried egg noodles in the old brush pen shop and Ning Kei's answer. He laughed at himself and said, "Someone seems to see the world colder than I do." He looked at Li Yu's brows and said seriously, "Your Highness, he does not want others to know. So please keep this little secret for him." Li Yu was slightly startled and then said sarcastically, "Does that idiot think he can keep this a secret for a long time? Does he think he can hide his identity forever by wearing a black mask and combing his hair in the style of the Yueluan kingdom?" Qiao Shaoshu answered, "He will be admitted to the academy soon, and he will enter the second floor. At that time, he will naturally not have to worry about being plotted against." Li Yu thought of Liu Qingchen's evaluation of Ning Quebec. She frowned and asked, "Why do you all think so highly of him?" Qiao Shaoshu smiled and said, "Because he is worth it." Thinking of the knife light at the entrance of the northern mountain road, the leaping figure among the flames, and the story beside the bonfire, Li Yu's expression unknowingly softened. However, her voice was still cold and sarcastic. "I gave him a chance, but he refused to take it. I thought he was an oddball who did not care about his future, power, and wealth. I did not expect him to choose such a way to appear in Chang'an City because he thought it was not exciting enough. But no matter what, I brought him to Chang'an City, so he is my man." Li Yu looked at Qiao Shaoshu with a faint smile. "Uncle Qiao, shouldn't you tell me in advance that you are using my man so cruelly?" The confrontation of words was, after all, a psychological contest. Fourth Princess Li Yu was naturally the most outstanding woman in this aspect among the younger generation. However, in front of Spring Breeze Pavilion old Qiao, who was used to seeing bloodshed, she did not have the slightest advantage. Qiao Shaoshu smiled and said, "If he is your man, why would he be so embarrassed over a small shop? And I believe that the princess should also be able to see that the little guy will never be anyone's man. He is only his own man." After several attempts, he did not find the slightest opportunity to take advantage of. He did not even find a gap to talk about business. Li Yu was silent for a moment. She waved her hand to signal the palace maids and old maidservants behind her to leave. She looked at him with a solemn expression and said, "Uncle Qiao." Qiao Shaoshu dodged again and repeated, "This commoner dares not." Li Yu shook her head and said seriously, "Everyone in the world knows that from today on, Spring Breeze Pavilion old Qiao can no longer be the commoner that father hid among the people. He is no longer just the leader of the first gang in Chang'an. Whether it is the leader of the bodyguards or the ministers, there will definitely be a place for you in the world. When you were Spring Breeze Pavilion old Qiao, those ministers dared to use my or the Empress's name to recruit you and intimidate you. Now that you have jumped out of the sea, do you think that you can stay out of it?" Li Yu looked at him quietly and said in a sincere and unambiguous tone, "The Empress is a smart person, and I am not stupid. So we will not do anything that father does not like us to do, but we have to do something. I hope that you can support me. When we were young, you held me in your arms. You also held my little brother. You've seen my mother. Could it be that you have the heart to see my little brother lose his throne? Could it be that you have the heart to see my mother in the netherworld spring filled with unwillingness and sorrow?" The Tang Empire did not care about fighting for the throne. Whoever succeeded the throne was all in the hands of His Majesty. The seemingly cowardly but sober His Majesty would not allow his wife and children to do anything that would harm the country and go beyond his tolerance. However, he wanted to see who would perform better. In this world, in history, there were very few examples as transparent and open as the Tang imperial family. However, what Li Yu said to Qiao Shaoshu by the lake today still seemed too open and even a little naked. It was extremely out of line with ordinary people's imagination of such palace conspiracies. Xiao Xiaoshu was silent for a long time. He looked at her and said in a gentle voice, "Your Highness is really like your mother. You are extremely intelligent and know that any temptation is meaningless to a rough person like me. Instead, it is more appropriate to use a jianghu tone. However, this is ultimately the Emperor's decision. I am just a small fish in the Tang Empire's sea. Even if I am lucky, I will not be of any use. Uncle Chao, you are too humble. You must know that in all these years, I have never seen my father trust someone so much. Furthermore, he forcefully suppressed the talented exam candidate of the academy in the gutter of the eastern city for so many years. I think my father must feel extremely guilty towards you." Li Yu looked at him firmly and said, "The most important thing is that you are in the Tang Empire's sea. Even if you jump out of the sea, you will eventually fall back into the sea. One day, you will have to choose which way to swim." Before she could finish her sentence, Xiao Xiaoshu smiled and raised his arm to point at the lake. He said, "I'm a small fish, but I don't like to stay in a pond. Even if it's as big as the sea, it's still a pond. So if I have to choose which way to swim, I'll choose to go ashore in the end." Li Yu frowned and said, "Fish will die of thirst when they go ashore. But before they die, they can breathe enough air." Xiao Xiaoshu smiled. "Uncle Chao, you insist that the imperial court is that pond? Can you find a pond bigger than the Tang Empire in the world? Although Jianghu is smaller, it is more relaxed and casual. In comparison, I would rather be far away from Jianghu than stand above the imperial court." Li Yu frowned and looked at the middle-aged scholar in a green robe by the lake. She suddenly realized that she could not understand some people. She sighed and said, "Jianghu is dangerous." Xiao Xiaoshu smiled and said, "But Jianghu is far enough, so there is freedom." Li Yu shook her head and said, "What kind of freedom can there be?" Xiao Xiaoshu looked at her as if he was looking at a junior and said, "The freedom not to choose." Ning Kei's hands were itchy. This was an itch that he had been used to for many years. It had penetrated deep into his bones and blood vessels and could not be removed. He could only endure it. In the quiet and empty imperial study, he walked from the door to the desk, from the desk to the bookshelf, and from the bookshelf to the door. His right hand, which was hidden in his sleeve, kept rubbing his fingers, but he could not stop the itch that came from the deepest part of his body. It itched to see the famous masters on the wall. It itched to see the Hengdian pure silk that was randomly placed. It itched to smell the pine ink of Qinzhou. It itched to touch the fine wrinkles of the bud paper in Xianzhou. It itched even more when his eyes fell on the 5 words written by the emperor, "The fish leaped into the sea." It itched even more. The only way to relieve the itch was to write. However, it was a very stupid choice to use the imperial pen to continue His Majesty's words in the imperial study. He might be heavily punished or even receive a more severe punishment. But it really itched. When Xiao Xiaoshu was talking about choice and freedom by the lake, Ning Kei was also going through this painful choice. Tear it up quickly after writing it. Having found a good excuse, Ning Kei shouted happily and rushed to the front of the table. Like a good man eating meat and drinking wine, he melted the ink, grabbed the brush and spread the new paper. The itch that had accumulated in his heart for several breaths was all turned into joy, and with one stroke, he wrote 5 ink characters. The flower blooms on the shore. Chapter 69. Lu Ban wielding an axe in front of his door, Du Kong selling wine in front of his shop, and the headmaster of academy drying books in front of his door were, of course, the most overconfident actions. But if one were to look at it from another perspective, when Lu Ban saw the guy wielding an axe in front of his door, Du Kong saw the guy selling wine in front of his shop, and the headmaster of academy saw the guy drying books in front of his door, especially when they realized that the guy was the most sacred and supreme existence in the secular world, would they feel the same itch as Ning Kei from the bottom of their hearts? I want to be a wooden bird and tell that guy that the prototype of an airplane is like this. I want to brew a pot of wine and tell that guy that the wine of a fallen country is like this. I want to write a few words to tell that guy that this is the soul soup. I want to write a few more words to tell that guy what is called writing. Even if you are the human sovereign or the heaven emperor, you have to listen to me. At this moment, Ning Ke was immersed in this extreme pleasure. He looked at the gradually drying ink on the Xianzhou bud paper with satisfaction. He imagined that he was playing the role of His Majesty's calligraphy teacher, using those brush strokes to slap the old man's palm, and scolding him with disdain and disdain. I wrote wrong again. Stretch out your hand and hit the board. He was very satisfied with the 5 words he had written and even felt that they were the best he had written in recent years. Other than the excellent quality of the brush, ink, paper, and inkstone, and the wonderful location of the imperial study, the most important reason was that he had accumulated too much itch in the room. More importantly, the first 5 words were written by the emperor himself. He admired his round brush with relish and the straight and broad structure. For a moment, he was a little reluctant to destroy the paper. So he was ready to put it into his sleeve after the paper was dry and quietly take it out of the palace. However, at this moment, an angry roar suddenly sounded outside the imperial study, which had been silent all this time. Where did that bastard go? Ning Ke was shocked. When he looked up, he saw the door of the imperial study being pushed open by a hand. His pupils constricted slightly, and with a quick flick of his finger, the ink paper on the drying table lightly slid into a gap in the corner of the bookshelf. Then, he turned around, folded his sleeves, and pretended to look at the books on the bookshelf. As his sleeves brushed past, the row of books on the bookshelf had already changed directions, and the flowers bloom on the shore was firmly pressed in the innermost area. No one could tell that someone had moved it. The person who walked into the imperial study was a short and strong middle-aged general. He wore a palace bodyguard uniform and had a black gold belt tied around his waist, showing his extremely high rank. The middle-aged general saw Ning Ke beside the bookshelf and the lad who was engrossed in reading like a calligraphy addict. He was so angry that he rolled his eyes and yelled, "Who the hell let you in?" Ning Ke pretended to be absent-minded, but in fact, his ears had been pricking up to listen to the movements behind him. When he heard this, his heart thumped. He guessed that there was some misunderstanding in this matter. It should be that he had misheard something when the little eunuch had told him what to pay attention to. It should not be a conspiracy like the White Tiger Hall. If the palace wanted to deal with a nobody like him, there was no need to do so much. However, the crime of entering the imperial study without an edict could be serious or minor. No matter what, he could not let himself get into such trouble. He was like a cute little scholar who had been dazzled by His Majesty's collection of books. He turned around and rubbed his eyes. He looked at the short and fat bodyguard at the door and said with a face full of confusion, "I have entered the palace by imperial edict. Is there a problem?" The short and fat bodyguard was slightly startled. He had probably never imagined that someone could be so calm and unperturbed after being caught red-handed in the imperial study. He could not help but reveal an inexplicable expression on his face. He painfully covered his forehead with his hand and angrily said to himself, "Old Chow, you bastard. You didn't even teach me the rules in advance." Ning Ke walked out from behind the desk and bowed with his hands folded in front of his chest. He asked in confusion, "General, do you know Brother Chow?" In Lin 47th Street, in Spring Breeze Pavilion, no matter how Chow Xiaoshu had behaved in high spirits, Ning Ke had always refused to acknowledge him as a brother. At this moment, he did not care and naturally said the word brother. It was to protect himself. As for the rhetorical question, it was to turn defense into offense. Anyway, his purpose was to divert the other party's attention from the imperial study to somewhere else. The short and fat bodyguard confirmed that there was no one around the imperial study. He looked at the array in the room with a vigilant and uneasy expression. He did not find anything strange. He covered his forehead again with some lingering fear and looked at Ning Ke in pain. He said, "You rascal, hurry up and come out. I have been looking for you outside for almost an hour. Who would have thought that you would dare to come in here? Remember, you did not come in here today." Don't even think about showing off to others for the rest of your life. Otherwise, I will destroy you. Ning Ke followed the nagging bodyguard out of the imperial study. He took 2 steps to the west and came to the guard duty room in the Spring Harmony Hall not far away. In the dark room, he finally knew that the short and fat, amiable guy in front of him, who spoke with a Hebei accent and whose every word seemed to have the smell of scallions, was actually the deputy commander of the Tang Imperial Bodyguards, Su Chongshan. He was also the person that Cao Shaoshu had asked him to meet last night. His Majesty is very fond of calligraphy. Coincidentally, you are a seller of calligraphy, so he brought you into the palace with this identity. It was just to avoid people's eyes and ears. But you rascal, actually entered the imperial study without saying a word. Do you really think that you are a master of calligraphy? Do you really think that His Majesty asked you to come and appreciate the calligraphy? Su Chongshan pointed at Ning Ke's nose angrily and growled in a low voice, spittle flying everywhere. Ning Ke rubbed his nose in embarrassment and thought to himself, His Majesty did not ask me to come and appreciate the calligraphy, but I have already written something in the imperial study. What can you do to me? Thinking of this, he thought of the flower blooms on the shore, in the corner of the bookshelf. He thought to himself, how can I take that thing out in the future? Su Chongshan was a little tired from all the scolding. He supported his thick waist and said, let's get down to business. Ning Ke smiled and replied, please go ahead. Su Chongshan looked at him strangely and said, you're such a cheeky young man. You don't look like what old Chow said at all. That's because you are too powerful, Commander. Ning Ke explained very seriously. Anything could be penetrated by mountains of gold and silver, but not by flattery. Even the most immature and clumsy flattery had its uses, not to mention that the one doing it was a seemingly immature and clumsy young man. Su Chongshan's expression became slightly better. He coughed twice and asked, now you should know who old Chow works for, right? Ning Ke frowned slightly and asked, is Brother Chow the commander's subordinate? I don't have the guts to order Spring Breeze Pavilion old Chow around. Also, don't call him Brother Chow in the future. Those old people are few and far between now. We are used to calling him Second Brother Chow. Su Chongshan said seriously. Then he thought of the massacre in the spring rain last night and old Chow's evaluation of this young man. He found Ning Ke more pleasing to the eye. He suddenly changed the topic and asked with a smile, why did you help old Chow last night? I took 500 taels of silver. Ning Ke answered honestly. No one would risk their life for a person they had just met for 500 taels of silver. Moreover, that person was a 16-year-old young man who was about to enter the academy. Su Chongshan did not believe his explanation, so he did not think that Ning Ke was greedy for money. Instead, he thought that Ning Ke was a true man of character. Suddenly, he found Ning Ke more pleasing to the eye. His Majesty likes people of character, and so do I. Su Chongshan looked at him with a smile and asked, then I only need to ask one question. That is, are you willing to sacrifice your life and even your reputation for the empire? Ning Ke was slightly stunned. He frowned and thought for a long time. On the one hand, he was trying to guess the real reason why this bigwig would ask such a question. On the other hand, he did not understand why the bigwig would use the word even in front of the word reputation. Was reputation more important than life? This question was very big and broad, very serious and sacred, but also very confusing. He thought for a long time. He thought about the previous generals of the city of Wei, the comrades who had gone through thick and thin with him, and the passionate people in Chang'an. He answered seriously and slowly, if I'm forced, I can sacrifice my life. Speaking of this, he suddenly thought of a scene last night. After Cao Shaoshu reluctantly put down the bowl of noodle soup, he looked at the gray wall across the shop and talked to himself. So he hesitated and added, but some things can't be done. Su Chongshan looked at him solemnly. He realized that the young man did not give a powerful answer without hesitation. Instead, He thought about it seriously and even embarrassedly for a long time. Regarding this, the deputy commander was not angry. Instead, he was very appreciative, because he knew that a prudent answer after thinking was more reliable than a hot-blooded and impulsive one. From now on, you are a member of the Tang Imperial Bodyguard. There were no more questions or tests. It was just a simple conversation. Su Chongshan decided to recruit this young man into the Tang Imperial Bodyguard team. Part of the reason was that Cao Xiaoshu was his guarantor, but more importantly, he really liked the young man's temperament when he answered the questions. So it was Ning Kei's turn to be shocked and speechless. He looked at the matte ebony waist token in his hand and looked at the identification mark on it. After a long silence, he said blankly, "I became an imperial bodyguard after a fight?" The fish dragon gang was forced to the light by the idiotic ministers in the imperial court. Don't look at me like that. The word idiot was given by His Majesty in a rage last night. So we need to rearrange some people to hide in the dark. Su Chongshan explained coldly, "This is the glory of the Tang Empire. Don't think about rejecting it." "It's not about rejecting it." Ning Kei said helplessly, "The problem is, what does the imperial court need me to do? What can I do? Most importantly, I'm about to participate in the academy entrance exam." Su Chongshan's expression changed slightly when he heard the word academy. It was not for any other reason. As an old guard, he knew very well what Cao Xiaoshu had gone through in the past. It was also because of those past events that this batch of secret guards now had the treatment that they did not have in the past. He looked at Ning Kei with a gentle smile and said, "Don't worry. You can enter the academy if you can. After you graduate from the academy, you will still be serving the imperial court. There is no conflict between the two." "You haven't told me what I need to do," Ning Kei insisted. "The fish dragon gang has been exposed, but there is no longer any problem with the Jianghu in Chang'an." Su Chongshan frowned slightly and said, "Your task is very simple. It is to collect information. We will talk about the details later." If Jianghu was no longer a problem, then the biggest problem other than the imperial power was the world of cultivators. Thinking of the fact that he was about to enter the academy and the vague instructions of the deputy commander, Ning Kei naturally thought of a possibility. Was the imperial court going to attack the academy? The guard token in his hand was a little wet from his sweat. But he knew that he could not refuse these things. He only hoped that things would go differently from what he imagined. Chapter 70. If life wanted to do something to you and you could not resist it, then you could only do this and that. If you were not very resistant, then it would be much easier to do this and that. Based on this understanding, Ning Kei quickly got rid of the shock and distress. He scratched his head and looked over Su Chongshan's thick shoulders, through the window of the duty room, and said, "Can I ask another question?" Su Chongshan answered straightforwardly, "I'll answer if I can." "Why me?" Ning Kei asked. Su Chongshan answered, "Old Chao admires you. He thinks that if you are lucky, you will be even more successful than him in the future. Besides, because of what happened last night, Chang San and Chen Qi also think highly of you. According to the rules of the bodyguard office, whether it is a guard in the open or a guard in the dark, the senior's opinion is relatively more important." "Your Excellency." Ning Kei covered his forehead and said, "If so many people know my identity as a guard in the dark, then I would like to know the meaning of the word dark. Do you want me to go back to Lin 47th Street to light some firecrackers and pull up a few banners to tell the world that I did this?" Of course, Su Chongshan could hear the dissatisfaction and anger in his words. He frowned slightly and explained, "The Tang Empire is a place with rules. Even if the nobles in the palace know your identity, no one would dare to expose you and risk the wrath of His Majesty. As for Chang San and the others, they have already proven their loyalty and reliability." Ning Kei put down his arms and shook his head. "Only time is the only standard to test the truth. They have used more than 10 years to prove it." Su Chongshan said expressionlessly, but I like what you said. It's a pity that you want to enter the academy, so you can only do it in the dark. Otherwise, based on old Chao's admiration for you and what he said, would really want to train you to be my successor. Although I, Su Chongshan, was born in the army and still have some courage, I can't be as carefree as old Chao. I don't even know who you are, yet I dare to put my life in your hands. After all, the Imperial Bodyguard is related to His Majesty's safety, so the Imperial Bodyguard Office has already investigated your ancestors. It's a pity that the Bodyguard Office only found that you were 7 years old and confirmed that you were an orphan. They couldn't find your ancestors. But we know your performance in the city of Wei, and we like you very much. Su Chongshan stretched out his broad palm and patted Ning Kei's shoulder heavily. He said, "Your military experience and the military achievements you have accumulated over the years are enough to prove your loyalty to His Majesty and the Tang Empire." Ning Kei did not panic when he heard that the bodyguard office had investigated him. He knew that no one in the world knew who he was except for Sang Sang and the dead darky. He slowly fiddled with the slightly damp waist token in his palm. After a moment of silence, he said, "According to what you said before, no one should take the initiative to contact me. So how should I report anything to you? I don't think we'll meet again in the palace, right? I never imagined that this kind of thing could be done in such an open and above-board place. Why not?" Su Chongshan said proudly, "There's no safer place in the world than the Tang Imperial Palace." Ning Kei sighed and reluctantly accepted the fact. He then raised his head and looked up expectantly. He said, "I can't let anyone know about the reward of reputation. Then, when can I meet the Emperor?" Su Chongshan looked at him blankly and then burst into laughter. He rubbed his round belly and laughed. "You little brat. Do you think that you're entering the palace today to meet the Emperor? Isn't that so? How old are you?" 16. "What's your surname?" "Ning." Su Chongshan looked at him and asked seriously, "You're not a centenarian and you're not a distant relative of the royal family. Then why are you so thick-skinned?" Ning Kei touched his cheeks, which could barely be considered delicate, and shook his head. Su Chongshan sighed and looked at the lad. He shook his head and said, "Chang III and the others have not seen His Majesty for many years. Then why do you think that you're qualified to meet the Emperor alone?" After a moment of silence, Ning Kei said seriously, "My handwriting is really good. If His Majesty likes it, he might be reluctant to let me be a bodyguard and directly summon me to the palace to be a reading attendant or something." Su Chongshan stopped smiling and looked at him mockingly. Other than bodyguards, only eunuchs can stay in the palace all year round. Ning Kei's expression froze and he smiled awkwardly. He did not dare to continue this topic. Su Chongshan was the deputy commander of the Tang Imperial Guards and was naturally very busy. Today, he purposely took some time and even more time to summon this lad alone. This was already giving Chao Xiaoshu a lot of face. After the discussion, he naturally chased Ning Kei away without hesitation and rushed back to the side of the Palace of Council to serve. Ning Kei walked out of the empty guard duty room and was worried about how he would get out of the palace. He wondered if he would end up in a spring willow palace like how he had entered the imperial study by mistake. He wondered if he would meet a cold and resentful woman in the palace and something really f***ed up. Or if he would meet a princess whom he thought was an idiot but still occasionally thought of. Then he saw the little eunuch who had led him into the palace standing beside him like a ghost. Even though he wanted to question the little eunuch for not being clear about what he had told him and causing him to be tempted and frightened by the drugs in the imperial study, he finally kept his mouth shut for safety reasons. He obediently followed the little eunuch through the quiet willow path and the stone gate. He got on the cramped horse carriage and passed through the laundry station towards the outside of the palace. Just as they were about to pass through the palace alley of the laundry station, Ning Kei suddenly felt something and felt a tightness in his chest. He ignored the little eunuch's stern warning look and lifted a corner of the window curtain and looked out with furrowed brows. His gaze passed through the narrow alley, the sounds of clappers and the smell of honey locust in the alley, and fell on the corner of a magnificent palace in the distance. On the eaves of the high blue sky, there were 8 or 9 beasts on the eaves with different expressions. He did not know what these beasts on the eaves were called or what auspicious signs or monsters they were. He stared at them blankly and felt his chest getting tighter and tighter. His heart beat faster and faster as if it was about to break his ribs and jump out. As his heart beat faster, the beasts on the eaves in the distance became clearer and clearer. The lines of the tiles that had been washed by the wind and rain for hundreds of years became more and more lively, as if they would become living creatures in the next moment. He groaned and covered his chest. He could not help but think of that rainy day when he and Sang Sang saw the vermilion bird statue of Chang and for the first time. He stared at the beasts on the eaves in the palace fiercely and his face became paler and paler, but he refused to look away. A very fierce quarrel broke out in the imperial study earlier. Su Chongshan, the deputy commander of the bodyguards, and Eunuch Lin, the deputy director of the inner palace, stood outside the imperial study like 2 statues. No matter what they heard, they did not dare to show any expression on their faces. That was because the 2 bigwigs had a grandson sitting deep in their hearts. They were scared, confused and shocked to the extreme. At the same time, they felt that the person in the imperial study was 2F** King Brave. The Tang Empire had been in Tianqi for 13 years, and no one had ever seen the emperor so angry. Even after the Spring Breeze Pavilion incident last night, the emperor only slammed the table a few times and scolded 30 or so idiots. But today, in the imperial study, the emperor had smashed several teacups and scolded many dirty words that should never be heard by others. Qiao Xiao Shu. If you still don't know what's good for you, don't blame me for teaching you a lesson. How to teach you a lesson? I really don't King know. You're so stupid and stubborn. Why don't you understand the principles of the world? Fine. I'll call you second brother Chow for the last time today. Are you staying or not? The imperial study suddenly became quiet. Su Chongshan and Eunuch Lin, who were outside the door, could not help but look at each other. They confirmed that the shock and envy in each other's eyes were no different from their own. They turned their heads again and silently looked at the flowers and trees again. The room was silent for a long time. Then, Qiao Xiaoshu's calm, gentle, but firm voice sounded. No. A dull and crisp sound was heard. It should be the sound of the Tang Emperor smashing his most precious Huangzhou mud-sinking inkstone. Su Chongshan and Eunuch Lin, who were guarding outside the door, could no longer remain silent. Su Chongshan was especially worried that the emperor would make a decision that he would regret in the future. He took 2 steps forward and was ready to knock on the door to admonish the emperor. At this moment, the door of the imperial study was pushed open with a squeak. Qiao Xiaoshu, who was dressed in a green robe, stepped over the threshold and walked out. After the door behind him was closed, he turned around and knelt on the ground. He kowtowed 3 times solemnly, as if he was a monarch and his subject. Then, he stood up and smiled at Su Chongshan and Eunuch Lin. He left the imperial study and walked out of the palace. There were no eunuchs or palace maids leading the way. He walked alone slowly, as if he was touring a garden. He had been to this palace many times in the past 10 years and was very attached to it. Over the years, he did not enter the palace often and missed it very much. As he walked to the shore of the big lake called Leaving Sea, Qiao Xiaoshu looked at the lake quietly with his hands behind his back. He looked at the golden carps swimming happily in the lake. Suddenly, the corners of his lips curled up slightly, revealing a refreshing smile like the sun shining through the shade of willow trees. Wherever his calm and smiling gaze fell, the figures of those merrily swimming golden carps suddenly stiffened, and they actually became completely still. They were like jade fish that were floating in a crystalline green wave, full of vitality, yet completely devoid of business. Qiao Xiaoshu murmured, after being in the confinement for a long time, I returned to nature. Heaven and earth were the confinement, the human was trapped, the heart was the confinement, the body was trapped. Once the confinement of the heart was broken, the confinement of heaven and earth would also be broken. In the imperial study, the golden crown was carelessly thrown into a pile of firewood in the corner. The Tang Emperor stared angrily at the fish leaping across the sea written by Ling Chen on the table. His face was full of unwillingness and regret. He did not know that in the corner of the bookshelf, someone had secretly added the flower blooms on the shore for him. Suddenly, he raised his head and looked in the direction of the imperial garden through the window. His eyebrows slowly furrowed and then slowly relaxed. Finally, it turned into peace and relief. He said with a faint self-mockery, "Maybe you are really right." In a certain palace, a Taoist priest of about 40 years of age was taking the empress' pulse. Suddenly, his eyebrows shot up. His finger rudely scratched the empress's plump wrist and he turned his head to look behind him in a daze. The empress slightly frowned and wondered why the nation master, who had always been quiet and gentle, would lose his composure like this. The Taoist priest stared blankly and suddenly beat his chest and stamped his feet, howling, "I was wrong, I was really wrong. I should have persuaded His Majesty to let the little tree go earlier, or just let him enter the academy. With the ability of the headmaster of the academy and the little tree's understanding and state of mind, the Tang Empire will definitely have another peerless powerhouse in these years. Maybe we can even fight with the South Jin Kingdom. What a pity, what a pity, it's a pity that it's too late for more than 10 years. In a side alley of the laundry bureau, Ning Ke sat in the horse carriage and stubbornly stared at the beasts on eaves that seemed to be coming to life. His face became paler and his heart beat faster and faster. Suddenly, all the feelings disappeared. In front of the vermilion bird gate of the palace, the middle-aged man looked back at the stone beasts on the eaves of the main hall and laughed loudly. His laughter was unusually free and clear, without any distracting thoughts. The beasts on eaves seemed to understand the meaning of his laughter and returned to peace and serenity. In the midst of his laughter, he walked out of the main gate of the palace in a fluttering indigo robe. From today onwards, Cheng and would have one less leader called Old Chow from the Spring Breeze Pavilion. There would be one more powerhouse in the world who entered the knowing destiny state while watching the fish in the lake. Chapter 71. Returning to Lin 47th Street, Ning Ke pushed open the door of the shop and entered the backyard. He took out the matte ebony waste token and casually threw it on the bed, as if it was a piece of useless firewood. Sang Sang sat on the bed with her 2 cold feet tucked in the warm quilt. She was concentrating on mending his old coat. She glanced at the waste token on the quilt and picked it up curiously. She squinted her eyes and looked at it carefully for a long time under the light from the transparent tiles on the ceiling. She asked, "Young master, what is this?" "The token of an imperial bodyguard. Secret bodyguard, the kind that can't be seen in the light." Ning Ke sat by the table and drank a few mouthfuls of water from the kettle. He felt a little depressed when he thought that he didn't even have a sip of tea when he entered the palace today. Knowing that Ning Ke had an official identity, just as she had predicted last night, Sang Sang squinted her willowy eyes and smiled happily. However, she had always been more direct when it came to matters. "How much salary can I get every month?" Ning Ke was stunned. He put down the teapot in his hand and recalled the previous conversation. He hesitated and said, "At least 40 or 50 taels of silver?" Sang Sang frowned and her tanned face was full of dissatisfaction. She said, "Not as much as I thought." Ning Ke shook his head and chided her with a smile, "Now that we have 2,000 taels of silver, we should be more generous in the future." Upon hearing this, the dissatisfaction on Sang Sang's face disappeared. She looked at him with a smile and waved her little hand. She said, "Young master, after you left, they secretly sent the silver over." Ning Ke was a little confused. He walked straight to the bed and leaned beside the little handmaiden. He asked curiously, "Where did they put it?" Sang Sang looked outside mysteriously and put down the needle hole in her hand. She pinched the 2 corners of the quilt on her waist with her 2 small hands and nervously opened a gap. She slightly raised her chin and motioned for him to look inside. Ning Ke raised his eyebrows and looked into the quilt incredulously. He saw a dense layer of silver beside Sang Sang's slender legs. Even though it was covered by the thick quilt, he could still see the dazzling silver halo in the dim light. He opened his mouth slightly and forcefully suppressed the excitement in his heart. Pretending to be calm, he lectured, "I've told you before, cough cough, to be more generous. It's just 2,000 taels of silver. Look at how excited and nervous you are. I thought it was strange that you were curled up in bed in broad daylight. So it turns out that you were worried about this. Don't you feel anxious about the money?" Sang Sang looked up at him and shook her head firmly, indicating that the silver was not uncomfortable at all. Ning Ke coughed again and rubbed the little handmaiden's head dotingly. He said, 2,000 taels of silver can be covered with a quilt. What will you do when your young master earns 8,000 or 10,000 taels of silver in the future? Spring in Chang'an was very beautiful. Spring rain fell from time to time, giving birth to all the green leaves and tender flowers on the streets and alleys. No matter if you were standing in the doorway or in the pavilion, you could see the colors of life. Lin 47th Street in the eastern city seemed to come alive with the growing spring colors, and gradually became lively. After the Spring Breeze Pavilion incident, the Minister of Revenue was demoted and the entire shipping department was purged. The land requisition that had been bothering for months naturally came to an end. The warehouse of the shipping department on the other side of the wall was dead silent like a big tomb. Although the Fish Dragon gang was forced to step onto the bright stage, they did not forget to clean up the darkness of the whole city. At this time, no one dared to do anything to Chao Xiaoshu Street, not even to look at it. It was originally an excellent location and a quiet place to do business. Now, without the pressure of the government and the deterrence of the underworld, those closed shop doors naturally reopened. Whether it was the new boss who took over or the old boss who bought back the lease at a high price, they all rolled up their sleeves and were ready to take advantage of the warm spring weather to do a good job. Business was a human industry, and what it emphasized was to gather wealth and people. In the past, there was only one shop on Lin 47th Street, and it exuded a sense of decline from the bottom of its bones. Naturally, no one was willing to shop there, and the business was extremely poor. Now that all the shops on the street were open, and it was bustling under the spring trees, people naturally gathered. Compared to the neighboring shops, the old brush pen shop's business was still not very good. But compared to the cold fire and autumn smoke when it first opened, the situation was much better. Sang Sang was very busy every day, but the smile on her little face grew more and more, and she also insisted on not letting the young master hire more helpers. As for Ning Ke, he still had a bit of the rotten aura of a young scholar in his bones. Looking at the bustling scene in front of him and thinking of the cold old days, he increasingly disliked the customers who bought paintings and calligraphy. Now that he had more than 2,000 taels of silver in his hands, he did not care much about the income of the old brush pen shop, so he simply raised the price of the scrolls by a large margin. In his mind, since he was not short of money now, and they were so cheap as to come to his door to buy it, he naturally had to spend more money. Only then would he be worthy of himself, and only then would he be able to vent the resentment from the previous day. However, things always developed beyond his imagination. The price of the old brush pen shop was raised again and again, and finally it was raised to 5 times the price when it first opened, but he did not expect that there would be more and more customers who came to buy paintings. Although the old brush pen shop was still not famous in Chang'an City, it was already a brand in a small area in the eastern city. So this is how it should be played. Holding a small teapot, Ning Ke leaned against the door and looked at the customers in the shop. He happily sipped 2 mouthfuls of tea and listened to the quarrel in the newly opened fake antique shop next to him. He felt that life was really King wonderful. The shop owners on the street did not know that the revival of Lin 47th Street and the abundant profits they could make had something to do with the little boss of the old brush pen shop. They did not know that if Ning Ke had not helped Chao Xiaoshu to kill all the people on that rainy spring night, this street would probably still be as dead as before. Now, in their eyes, the young boss of the old brush pen shop was just a good-for-nothing who did not know how to make money and only knew how to enslave handmaidens. When business was good and money was earned, people would naturally be happy, but it would also easily cause some new problems. Now that business had only been good for 4 or 5 days, the boss of the fake antique shop already had plans to take a concubine. The fierce quarrel today was precisely because of this matter that the boss and his wife were fighting. How dare you think of taking a concubine with your looks? Why can't I? If I say you can't, then you can't. If you push me too hard, I'll complain to the Chang and local government. Even Her Majesty can't interfere in this matter. Why should the Chang and local government interfere? Even Ning Ke has a little handmaiden, and you kick me out of bed every day. Why can't I, your master, ask for a foot warmer? You want me to warm your feet? Not even a vermilion bird. Unless Ning Ke becomes the emperor. His surname is not Li. How can he be the emperor? Yueluan Kingdom, South Jin Kingdom, Great River Kingdom, as long as it exists in this world, I can be the emperor of any country. Ning Ke held the teapot and sipped happily, listening to the quarrel in the corner with great interest. He secretly praised the people of the Tang Empire for being so brave and open-minded that they even dared to mention the throne in a quarrel between husband and wife. Suddenly, his expression froze and he realized that he was actually mentioned in the quarrel. He could not help but feel annoyed. Just then, the customers in the shop had left. Sang Sang was tidying up the table. He walked in angrily and shouted, "I can't live like this anymore. The two in-laws quarrel and they dare to use me as an excuse. They even dare to discuss politics. Do they think that I, the imperial bodyguard, am dead? I'll go to the palace tomorrow to report them and kill their whole family." What he said was not false. He had the waist token of a secret guard, and he was responsible for listening to the public opinion of the people for the imperial court. Of course, he could report to his superiors if someone in the marketplace talked about the throne. However, although the laws of the Tang Empire were strict, they were very lenient in governing the people. Such angry words during a quarrel between husband and wife could only make those nobles laugh, not to mention the bodyguard office. Even if he handed the case file to His Majesty, it would only make those nobles laugh. Because of his words, Sang Sang thought of her worries these days. She frowned and asked, "Young master, in the stories you told me when I was young, spies always die miserably. Now that you are a secret guard, will there be any trouble?" Ning Ke put down the teapot and shook his head, saying, "Although it's a shameful waste token, I'm just a nobody. Who would care about my identity? Moreover, if there's trouble in the future, can't I avoid it?" After a short pause, he looked at Sang Sang and explained softly, "There is another reason why I accept this identity. If I really want to investigate those things and kill those people in the future, it will be more convenient to have the identity of an imperial bodyguard." Sang Sang was a little handmaiden who was lazy to think about things. After listening to his explanation, she felt that it was reasonable and stopped thinking about it. She said, "The umbrella, the knife and the coat are ready. Young master, when are you going to kill the second person? How about the knife? Do I need to sharpen it?" Ning Ke asked. Sang Sang answered seriously, "Even if it is to kill pigs, there must be some problems with the knife after killing dozens of pigs. Of course, it needs to be sharpened." The conversation between the master and the handmaiden had always been erratic. If it was not for them, there would definitely be some communication barriers. Especially the extremely calm and ordinary expressions on their faces. If it was heard by others, they would never think that they were talking about the bloody matter of killing people in the spring rain and sharpening the knife to kill again. At this moment, a loud voice came from the end of Lin 47th Street. There was a crowd rushing in that direction. Ning Ke curiously walked to the door of the shop and glanced over there. His expression changed slightly. He saw a middle-aged man in a green robe, surrounded and protected by a group of men in green robes and green boots. He was still wearing an elegant green robe and was talking to the shop owners with his hands cupped in front of his chest. There was a gentle smile on his face. From time to time, he cupped his hands in front of his chest and laughed. The gist of it was that he was here to ask the shop owners not to worry about their business, and if there were any problems, they could ask their subordinates to handle it. Following the middle-aged man's instructions, the 5 or 6 men who had been standing behind him silently cupped their hands in front of their chest. The middle-aged man in a green robe would stop in front of each shop for a while and say a few words. He seemed to be very patient. The subordinates around him also walked slowly with him and gradually walked to the end of the street. At the end of the street, there was a shop selling calligraphy and ink called Old Brush Pen Shop. Chapter 72. Old Chow from the Spring Breeze Pavilion owned numerous properties like the one on Lin 47th Street. He had been acquainted with many ambitious and high-ranking officials in the past. It seemed that if such a person were to leave Chang'an, he would definitely not bid farewell to the shop owners on Lin 47th Street. However, before he left today, he deliberately came to the Lin 47th Street to bid farewell to those shop owners. In the eyes of the upper class of the empire, they would probably think that this middle-aged man wanted to use this street that caused the Spring Breeze Pavilion incident to send a clear warning: don't mess around after I leave. But Ning Ke knew that this was definitely not the real reason he came to the Lin 47th Street. He wanted to bid farewell to himself, to the partner who had fought side by side in the spring rain and ate noodles with fried egg side by side. It was only because Ning Ke wanted to hide his identity and was now a secret guard of the palace that the middle-aged man would patiently bid farewell to all the shop owners so that no one in Chang'an would notice his existence. Thinking of this, even Ning Ke, who considered himself to be indifferent, could not help but feel warm in his chest. Looking at the approaching crowd and the smiling middle-aged man in a green robe in the middle, he did not know what to do. Arriving at the entrance of the Old Brush Pen Shop, Chao Xiaoshu looked at the lad and the little handmaiden in the shop and smiled slightly. He saluted with hands folded in front and said, "Boss Ning, nice to meet you." Ning Ke looked at the blocked entrance of the shop and the crowd of onlookers outside the crowd. He smiled bitterly and imitated Chao Chongsheng, bowing with his hands folded in front of his chest. "Greetings, second brother Chao." He had heard the words "second brother Chao" from Deputy Commander Su Chongshan. He thought it was intimate and respectful and very appropriate. But unexpectedly, Chao Xiaoshu was slightly startled and then burst into laughter. The imposing men standing behind Chao Xiaoshu all shook their heads and looked at Ning Ke with a bit of good-natured banter. People in Chang'an City called Chao Xiaoshu Old Chow of the Spring Breeze Pavilion, while the brothers in the Fish Dragon gang called him Grand Master or Big Brother. Few people knew that second brother Chao was called, so Ning Ke had unknowingly exposed himself. "I'm leaving Chang'an City soon, so I brought my brothers to meet you. Boss Ning, if you have any inconveniences in the future, you can go to them. Of course, I believe that as long as Boss Ning is diligent in managing the business, you will surely soar into the clouds. At that time, please don't forget to help these brothers of mine." Chao Xiaoshu looked at him and said with a smile. He pointed his right hand to the few men behind him with an imposing manner and said, "You have already met Chi 4. They are Chang 3, Lu V, Fei 6 and Chen 7. They are all my trusted brothers." Chao Xiaoshu had said this in other shops as well. But when he said it to Ning Ke, he naturally had a hidden meaning. Ning Ke understood, and so did the men at the entrance of the Old Brush Pen Shop. Chang San, Lu Wu, and the others looked at each other and saw the surprise in each other's eyes. Then they took a step forward and silently saluted Ning Quebec. They knew what had happened on that rainy spring night, and they already had a good impression of Ning Ke, who they had never met. At the same time, they also knew that Chao Xiaoshu had a very high opinion of this lad, but they did not expect it to be so high. There was even a hint of solemnity in his words. Chang Siwei looked at Ning Ke and said gently, "Boss Ning, if there is any inconvenience in the future, I will inevitably come and bother you." After the conversation in the palace last night, Ning Ke now understood that these men in front of him were the secret bodyguards that His Majesty the Tang Emperor had scattered among the people. Now that their identities had been revealed, they might return to the palace in a few days. Naturally, he would not neglect them. But listening to these words, he felt that something was wrong. Chang 3 was cold, Qi 4 was ruthless, Lu V was fierce, Fei 6 was fierce, and Qin 7 was dark. These were the evaluations of the generals of the Fish Dragon Gang in Chang and City. But looking at Chang Siwei's gentle expression, Ning Ke could not associate him with the word cold. He did not expect that this man had already planned to entangle himself with him. Since they wanted to deceive others, Chao Xiaoshu and the others naturally could not stay in the old brush pen shop for too long. They just casually chatted for a while, and then Chao Xiaoshu looked at Ning Ke with a smile and said 2 words. "Let's go." It was another light and gentle spring rain. Many pedestrians did not even bother to wear a conical hat. Ning Ke stood silently at the entrance of Lin 47th Street and looked at the gradually fading figures in the distance. He looked at the back of the middle-aged man in a green robe who was still carefree and casual, and suddenly felt a little regret in his heart. Brotherhood, of course, needs time to prove it. If I agree to be brothers with you just because you say so, wouldn't it be too embarrassing for me? I originally thought that after a few years, if I was good enough, it would be okay to be brothers with you. But you just left like this, and it still makes me feel very embarrassed. Ning Ke shook his head and sighed. He turned back and held Sang Sang's little hand and walked into the alley. A few blooming peach blossoms stretched out from above the alley wall, but they were cut into pieces by the spring rain and scattered on the bluestone pavement. The bluestone pavement at the city gate was also scattered with pistils. Beside a wine shop, Chao Xiaoshu and his brothers who had been through life and death with him for many years drank with the peach blossoms in Chang and City and then bid farewell. The spring rain came one after another, and people who had just met or reunited were either alive or dead. The lad from the city of Wei and his little handmaiden had unknowingly spent their first month in the capital of the empire, and then finally ushered in the most important day of their lives, if all those incidents of life and death were not counted. Today was the opening of the academy. That was right, it was indeed the opening of the academy. On the first day of the opening of the academy, those who could pass the academy entrance examination would become an honorable student of the academy in Chang'an. As for those candidates who failed the academy entrance examination, they had seen the solemn opening ceremony and the true appearance of the academy. Presumably, this memory would become an unforgettable and comforting part of their lives. Ning Ke and Sang Sang got up at 5:00 in the morning and began to freshen up for breakfast. The opening of the academy was a big event for the entire Tang Empire and even the whole world. As for the people of Chang and City, they had been looking forward to it for many days. All kinds of hawkers had opened their business in advance, so the master and handmaiden were lucky enough to eat hot and sour noodle slice soup. Ning Ke kept yawning and rubbed his tired eyes. It was obvious that he did not sleep well last night. Sang Sang had 2 dark circles under her eyes that were darker than the color of her skin. She looked even more nervous than her young master. The Ministry of Rights had a special carriage to pick up candidates, but Ning Ke chose to rent a carriage to go alone because he wanted to take Sang Sang with him. The carriage knew the identity of the customer and did not dare to neglect it. It had been waiting at the entrance of the alley since midnight. So the master and handmaiden left the old brush pen shop and immediately set off for the south. It was fine when they were in the eastern city, but once the carriage entered the southern city, it became difficult to move. At this time, it was dawn and the spacious Vermilion Bird Avenue looked a little gloomy. It was filled with hundreds of horse carriages. The sky was drizzling, and countless wheels were moving on the wet bluestone slabs, and many horses were kicking the rain angrily. The carriages from the Ministry of Rights were the first to pass. The carriages of candidates with the Academy entrance examination certificates were also under the command of the city gate guards. They squeezed out a bloody path and formed a long line along the drum tower towards the Vermilion Bird Gate. Today, the candidates of the academy in Chang and city were the most important people. The carriages of the officials from various departments and even the nobles who attended the opening ceremony were squeezed to the side. As for the rich scholars who had bought tickets to watch the fun, they were even pushed to the back of the line. The candidates were more important than the officials and the rich merchants who could bring in taxes for the empire. It seemed unimaginable, but it was the truth. Moreover, looking at the quiet and luxurious carriages and the calm attendants and guards, one could imagine that the opening ceremony of the academy had been like this for countless years. Sitting in the carriage, Ning Ke and Sang Sang lifted the curtain from time to look around. Their slightly nervous and anxious mood gradually calmed down. When the carriage finally drove out of the southern gate of Chang and city and headed south along the spacious official road towards the lofty mountain in the clouds, he was even in the mood to enjoy the scenery. The spring rain was still pattering down, but the mountain that suddenly rose from the Wei River plain was not affected at all. Because the mountain was clear in front of the mountain, and the mountain was above the rain clouds. The light of the rising sun was reflected by the cliff, and the light was sprinkled to the world, which felt very warm. Looking at the mountain in the distance under the sun and the drizzle, Ning Ke suddenly became extremely calm. He did not know why, but he felt that there was something there that attracted him, and there was a smell that he liked. South of Chang and under the mountain was the academy. It was the nameless academy that had gone through thousands of years of trials and hardships. It had a longer history than the Tang Empire, and it had trained countless famous ministers for the Tang Empire and the world. It was not mysterious but almost like a god. It was also the place that Ning Ke had to go through all kinds of hardships to enter. The nameless mountains suddenly rose between the plains and the river, and rushed straight to the sky. The nameless academy silently appeared in the mortal world, and stood tall for thousands of years. Dozens of carriages drove to the foot of the mountain, and the laughter in the carriages stopped abruptly. The students who came for the examination did not feel any pressure, but they had to remain silent because of the respect in their hearts. Under the clear light of the morning sun, there was a large area at the foot of the mountain. It was a gentle slope composed of green meadows and hills, undulating like solidified waves. The grass was like a painting, and there were dozens of intertwining and complicated roads in the painting. There were a few flowering trees planted at a certain distance along the road, and in the middle of the meadow, there were groups of flowering trees. They were the color of apricot blossoms or peach blossoms. They were not regular, but they were extremely beautiful on the hillside. Next to the window, Ning Ke and Sang Sang looked at the fairyland on earth, and looked at the black and white buildings of the academy above the grassy slope. They could not help but be a little lost in thought. After a long silence, he looked back at Sang Sang and said very seriously, "I must enter the academy." Sang Sang raised her little face and looked at him worriedly. She said, "Young master, have you finished the few sets of real questions for the academy entrance exam?" Ning Ke was silent for a long time, and after a long time, he said angrily, "Auspicious words. You little kid don't know what auspicious words are." Chapter 73. As they approached the academy and entered the meadow, they found that the pink and tender flowers were not the same. The most blooming apricot flowers were peach blossoms, but peach blossoms were the most numerous. The first peach blossoms hid behind the apricot flowers, looking up at the people who came to disturb their peace, full of shyness. Sang Sang raised her little face and curiously looked out of the window through Ning Ke's shoulder. She looked at the academy that was getting closer and closer, and the mountain behind the academy that was mostly covered by clouds and mist. She found that she did not feel uncomfortable, and her thin willow-shaped eyes squinted with a smile, full of joy. The students waiting for the exam got off the horse carriages one by one and lined up in front of a spacious stone platform under the direction of the officials from the Ministry of Rites and the instructors of the academy. Then they entered the 2 rows of yenyu verandas to rest. The students waiting for the exam came from different places. Most of them were personally selected by the instructors of the academy in the various counties and villages of the Tang Empire, and the rest were recommended by various departments. Among them, there were more than 70 candidates recommended by the military ministry alone. Although there were so many students sitting in the Yenyu verandas on both sides of the stone platform, it did not seem crowded at all. One could imagine how spacious the place was. Above the stone platform was the main building of the academy, hidden in the light mist of the flowers and trees. However, because the building itself was extremely tall, and the two slanting corridors were like the wings of a phoenix, it did not look like a pretty girl from a humble family. Instead, it gave off an indescribable feeling of freshness and straightforwardness. Ning Ke was not concerned about the appearance of the academy at this time. If he could enter the academy, he would have several years to measure the vastness of the academy with his feet and admire its beauty with his eyes. What he was more concerned about now was that there might be more than 500 candidates waiting in the Yenyu verandas, and the academy would only admit 200. 2 out of 5 was not a very high ratio, so he could not help but feel a little worried. Under the Yenyu porch, the students waiting for the exam were all calm and collected. No one chatted with each other, and no one took out the test papers in their arms to make a final sprint. They were the most outstanding youths in the Tang Empire, and even the whole world. Yes, among them, there were officers over 30 who were born in the frontier fortress and had a weather-beaten face, and there were also gifted children who were brought back to Chang and from a despicable village school and had a childish, ignorant, and uneasy look on their faces. Nevertheless, they were all considered youths. No one wanted to show their lack of confidence at this time. Ning Ke's confidence was getting weaker and weaker, and his right hand was slightly trembling. Several times, he was about to reach out to Sang Sang to ask for the test papers in her bag, but he forcibly withdrew his hand. Just as he was about to give up all his dignity and practice what he was best at, a solemn palace music suddenly sounded around the stone platform. The Yulin royal guards arrived, the guards of honor arrived, the officials from various departments arrived, and then the onlookers who bought tickets arrived, the palace guards arrived, the prince arrived, the empress arrived, and his majesty arrived. Thus, the students waiting in the Yenyu verandas stretched their waists, which were slightly sore from sitting for a long time, bowed deeply, and shouted, "Long live your majesty." Then there was no more time to study hard. While Ning Ke was nagging in his heart, he suddenly saw a beautiful, luxuriously dressed girl with a peaceful temperament walking on the stone platform. Who else could it be other than the princess? The fourth princess of the Tang Empire, Li Yu, walked slowly across the stone platform under the protection of eunuchs, maids, and nannies. She walked past the envious and admiring eyes of the young unmarried students in the corridor, and the surprised and uneasy eyes and whispers of the ministers. She walked along the long path and came to the main room of the academy. She came to the stone balustrade and bowed slightly to His Majesty and Her Majesty, and then quietly stood by the left side of His Majesty. Different from the malicious imagination of the enemies of other countries in the world, and different from the imagination of some conspiracy theorists such as Ning Ke, there was no conflict between the imperial power and the academy within the Tang Empire. Only a few people knew that the current emperor of the Tang Empire had once studied in the academy incognito for 2 years when he was young. After he ascended to the throne, he would come to the academy for a rest no matter how big or small the festivals were. He might even stay in the academy for a whole month in winter. If the imperial power of the Tang Empire was really afraid of or even checked the power of the academy, then the imperial court would not have put on such a big show when the academy opened, and the emperor would not have treated the academy as his second home. The ministers in the court knew the emperor's feelings for the academy, and knew the importance of the opening ceremony of the academy to the emperor. That was why they could not suppress their shock and exclaimed when they saw the fourth princess, Li Yu. They looked at the high balustrade and looked at the girls standing on the left and right of His Majesty, and their feelings were extremely complicated. The fourth princess had returned from the grassland for less than a month, and she had already shown the world how much she was loved. No one knew what Her Majesty, who was standing quietly on the other side of His Majesty, was thinking at this moment. The bell behind the mountain rang crisply. It was the first gathering of the academy's entrance examination. Hundreds of students waiting in the Yenyu corridor filed out under the direction of the instructors of the academy. They walked across the flat path under the balustrade of the main building of the academy and walked into the courtyard. The emperor of the Tang Empire looked at the handsome students who filed in under his gaze. He could not help but stroke his thin beard and showed a satisfied and happy smile. The fourth princess, Liu, saw her father's expression and said with a smile, "Congratulations, father. All the talents in the world have fallen into your hands." The emperor heard this and laughed. He did not think much of it, but did not feel disobedient. Her Majesty did not say anything. She just smiled and looked up at her husband. Her eyes were full of admiration, and her soft right hand gently touched his hand to show encouragement. The emperor looked at his wife and daughter beside him, the ministers on both sides, and countless future pillars of the empire. He could not help but feel a great sense of satisfaction. Suddenly, he felt as if someone was missing from his side. He frowned and asked a minister behind him, "The headmaster, still refuses to come?" The minister bowed in fear and said, "The headmaster said that the entrance examination of the academy is to select talents for His Majesty and the empire. He does not need to come. He needs to prepare his luggage and will leave in 2 days." The emperor remembered this and his face was full of regret. He was like a child who did a good deed but did not receive praise from his father. He patted the stone balustrade and sighed, "I almost forgot that the headmaster will leave for the empire earlier than usual this year." He looked back at the looming mountain in the clouds behind the academy. After a moment of silence, he bowed. In a pavilion by the roadside about 10 miles away from the mountain, a monk and a Taoist were drinking tea and chatting. It was still early in the morning, and no one knew why they were in such a good mood. The monk was about 30 years old. He looked handsome and peaceful, and naturally had a sense of transcendence. He looked at the vertical and horizontal lines on the ground and then looked up at the mountain and the academy in the distance. He suddenly said, "I heard that the headmaster is very tall." The Taoist usually looked solemn, but today he seemed very carefree. He reached out his hand and flicked the air lightly. He replied, "The headmaster is, of course, very tall." "How tall? How would a nobody like me know? Even the nation master of the Tang Empire doesn't know?" "You are the younger brother of the emperor of the Tang Empire, but you also don't know?" Chapter 74. At this time, Ning Ke was staring at a man. He stared very seriously and unscrupulously. He was one of the hundreds of candidates, and the man was standing in front of hundreds of candidates, talking with confidence and composure. Originally, he would receive hundreds of admiring and even scorching gazes, so he was not worried about being discovered by the man. He just stared at him like this, as if he wanted to eat the man into Mo Rui's pupils and swallow the man into Mo Rui's memories. The man was wearing a deep black robe with gold embroidery. He was handsome, with sword-like eyebrows, thin lips and a straight nose. When he smiled, there were a few wrinkles at the corner of his eyes. If he looked mature, he could be said to be in his 40s, or young, he could be said to be in his 30s. In short, he was a very charming man. He was Li Peiyan, the second most powerful man in the Tang Empire, the only brother of His Majesty, and the famous prince. He was also the culprit who took advantage of His Majesty's trip to the Great Lake 13 years ago to join forces with several important departments and General Xiahou to put Xianwei General Lin Guangyuan into prison for treason and execute the entire general's mansion. From escaping from Chang, and in the first year of Tianqi era to returning from the city of Wei this year, Ning Ke had been painfully struggling to survive in the world for 13 years. Not only did his hatred not fade, but because of the blood that burst out from the blade, the pain in his body and spirit, and the self-reproach hidden in the depths of his heart, it became stronger and clearer. There were many people in Chang, and that he had to kill, and Prince Li Peiyan was undoubtedly the first on the list. And today, in the academy, he saw his target for the first time, so he looked very seriously. He wanted to imprint the handsome and elegant prince's appearance in his mind, remember his eyebrows, his eyes, and the wrinkles at the corner of his eyes when he smiled, and remember the way his thin lips opened when he spoke, and then at some point in the future, he would tear it all apart. Prince Li Peiyan smiled gently and encouraged like a spring breeze, "Young people, you are all the best in the world. Today, you must use all your skills to deal with the academy entrance exam, but you must not be too nervous. After entering the academy, you must study hard. When you finish your studies, there will be countless positions in the Tang Empire waiting for you to bring glory to the empire." Ning Ke stared at him and gently blinked, his eyelashes cutting the spring breeze. Prince Li Peiyan looked to his left and looked at the candidates who were dressed differently from the Tangs. He opened his arms and laughed. "Although you are not from the Tang Empire, the Academy of the Tang Empire has always been impartial in its education. Please do not worry about the fairness of the admission. If you are successful in your studies, the Tang Empire will still wait for your service." Ning Ke stared at him coldly, his pupils as dark as the sun. Concentration could be understood as passion, and hatred could be understood as awe by diluting it with two other emotions. The students waiting for the exam outside the academy looked at the prince who was giving a speech before the exam. It was easy to understand the look in their eyes, so no one noticed Ning Ke's abnormality. Only Sang Sang raised her little face and looked at him worriedly. Then, she quietly reached her hand into his sleeve and gently held his slightly trembling hand. At this moment, an examinee from the Yen Kingdom mustered up his courage and exchanged a few words with the prince of the Tang Empire. No one knew what joke the prince said, but it caused the extremely nervous examinees to burst into laughter. Li Peiyan took the opportunity to laugh and talk about some interesting things, intending to let the crowd relax a little. The examinees were tactful and no longer stood still and solemn like before. Those who should rub their hands, those who should rub their waists, those who should chat idly, and those who should praised. The Tang Empire really has a wise king. The prince's virtue is just as the rumors say, like the spring breeze and the sun, making people happy. Virtue. Not all the candidates were flattering the prince, but Ning Ke could not help but frown slightly when he heard all the words around him. Thinking of Li Yu's title of virtuous princess of the Tang Empire, he murmured sarcastically, "Is there anyone who is not virtuous?" "Yes, the porridge is not salty." A candidate beside Ning Ke answered very seriously. It was unknown when the person standing beside Ning Ke was a young man. The young man was wearing a silk gown, with a gold belt and a precious jade pendant hanging on his waist. At first glance, Ning Ke could tell that the young man was from a rich family, and he was Ning Ke's acquaintance. "Chu Yuxian. You are also here for the academy exam?" Ning Ke turned to look at the young man and asked in surprise, "Why didn't you mention it when I went to the building a few days ago?" This young man was the favorite only son of one of the 7 noble families in Eastern City. He was also the person whom Mistress Jian scolded when Ning Ke stepped into the House of Red Sleeves for the first time. This person's name was Wang and his given name was Yuxian. He was generous and liked to make friends. When they first met, he wanted to treat Ning Ke to a banquet. Unfortunately, things did not go well. Later, when Ning Ke went to the House of Red Sleeves to chat with Dewdrop and the other girls, they met several times and drank a few cups of wine. Chu Yuxian looked straight ahead, squinted at Ning Ke, and said with a painful face, "My old man forced me to take the exam. He said that if I didn't pass the academy entrance examination in Chang'an, the bride's family would be picky when I got married in the future, and they would have to give more betrothal gifts. I was really forced by my old man, so I had to come." Ning Ke turned around and looked at the prince who was talking to the candidates one by one, and said in a low voice, "The time for the initial examination has long passed. How did you pass it?" Chu Yuxian raised his hand and made a 2 sign in front of him. He looked straight ahead and said, "I went through the military ministry." Ning Ke knew that there were more candidates recommended by the military ministry this year than in previous years. He thought that it was because the imperial court was worried about the shortage of young generals in the army, but he did not expect that there were so many inside stories. Thinking of how he had been killing enemies and chopping firewood in the grassland of the frontier fortress for the past few years, he could not help but feel aggrieved. He cursed in a low voice and said with emotion, 2,000 taels of silver. It's only enough to cover half a quilt, but it's enough to buy a place in the academy. Hearing this, Sang Sang, who had been standing quietly on the other side of him, could not help but look up at him and thought, young master, you are not happy. Why do you keep talking about that? 2,000 taels of silver? It's not even enough to send off the gatekeeper of the academy. My old man begged and begged for 20,000 taels of silver. And it's just a qualification for the academy entrance examination. There's no guarantee that you can get into the academy. Chu Yuxian looked at him with disdain and said, there is no government in the Tang Empire that dares to guarantee that you can get into the academy after receiving money. Not to mention those ministers, even His Majesty can't guarantee it. So don't despise me. My old man said that I'm just here to get some experience so that I can get married in the future. While they were chatting, Princely Pei Yan, accompanied by the officials and instructors, walked over. He ignored Ning Ke and Chu Yuxian and fixed his eyes on Sang Sang. Looking at this short and thin little girl, he turned around and said to the instructor with a smile, I didn't expect to see such a young female candidate. She's even 2 years younger than Wang Ying from Lin City, right? Wang Ying from Lin City was the young candidate who was brought back to Cheng and from the village school by the instructors of the academy. He was under 14 years old and was introduced to the prince by the officials. But they did not expect to see a little girl with a tanned face who was even more childish. But judging from her clothes, she was really. This is my handmaiden. Ning Ke gently bowed and explained. Princely Pei Yan knew that he had mistaken her for someone else and felt a little embarrassed. The officials behind him immediately stared at the instructor of the academy and said, how can a handmaiden enter the start of term ceremony? The middle-aged instructor of the academy did not seem to feel the anger of the officials at all and replied indifferently, there is no restriction for handmaidens to enter the academy. This is a ceremony, not an examination. Just don't let her in later. Being rebutted by the instructor, the official could not get angry. After all, no matter how high his status was and how much power he had, it was useless in a place like the academy. The prince laughed at himself and patted on Ning Ke's shoulder. Without saying anything more, he led the officials to move forward. Ning Ke gently bumped Chu Yuxian with his shoulder and looked at the instructor beside Li Pei Yan. He whispered and praised, Xian, this is what it means to be neither bland nor salty. I like the academy more and more. The bell rang for the second time and it was the last time. The instructor of the academy told them the rules of the examination room expressionlessly. But the students were too nervous to remember because the rules of the academy entrance examination were so loose that they were not forbidden to chat or ask questions, but they were not allowed to tell each other the answers. Stepping on the scattered peach petals on the flagstones, the students in long robes walked up the stairs and entered the classrooms to prepare for the examination. Sang Sang was left standing alone on the stone ground outside. At this moment, a few drops of spring rain fell. She looked up and squinted at the rain. Then she opened the big black umbrella on her back. The content of the academy entrance examination was similar to that of the imperial examinations of the Tang Empire. There were 6 subjects in total: etiquette, music, archery, driving, calligraphy, and mathematics. The total score was calculated and the students were admitted. In the morning of the academy entrance examination, there were 3 subjects, namely etiquette, calligraphy, and mathematics. The first one was mathematics, which the Tangs were not good at or were not interested in. It was quiet in the exam hall. The window frames on the wall framed the white walls and pink plum blossoms outside. It was like a peaceful and beautiful pastel painting, creating an environment that was very suitable for the mind to move. However, after receiving the mathematics test papers, the students who were sitting in front of their desks suddenly fell into chaos and sighed in a low voice. How can it be a comprehensive question? Some students pulled their hair in pain. Are we so unlucky? Some students looked pale. Because there was no rule against making noise in the examination room, the students could not help but express their dissatisfaction and sorrow in various ways. In previous years, mathematics was the most difficult question in the academy entrance examination. It was usually set by a doctor of literature and a professor of general mathematics. Sometimes the students did not even understand what the question was really about. Ning Ke put the brush on the inkstone and took a deep breath of the cool air. Then he opened the paper and saw only one question on it. There were about a dozen words on it. That spring, the headmaster of the academy traveled to another country and found a peach mountain with good wine. He climbed the mountain to enjoy the peaches and wine. He picked flowers and drank wine along the way. At first, he cut a caddy of peach blossoms and drank a pot of wine. Later, he cherished wine, so he cut another caddy of peach blossoms and drank half a pot of wine. Then he cut another caddy of peach blossoms and drank half a pot of wine. Then he cut another caddy of peach blossoms and drank half a pot of wine. Then he reached the top of the mountain and finished his wine. He looked around and asked the students, "How many caddies of peach blossoms and how many bottles of wine have you drunk today?" Chapter 75. Ning Ke was very good at controlling his emotions, or rather, he was good at suppressing his emotions pitifully, turning the dark night into sunshine on his face. He rarely showed the scenes of the distant world. However, today, when he entered the academy and entered the examination room, he looked at the peach blossoms outside the window and listened to the words of comprehensive mathematics. He could not help but think of the bitter life of practicing both arts and sciences in the winter and summer. But it was also because of his bitter life that the question on the ink scroll was not difficult for him. After the answer flashed in his mind, he could not help but sigh in a low voice, "Isn't this question 2F** king stupid?" It was indeed very stupid, because the answer was 2. Ning Ke used his wrist to grind the ink and dip the brush in the ink. He wrote down his answer very carefully on the paper. The headmaster of the academy drank 2 pots of wine and cut all the peach blossoms on the mountain. In the distant pavilion, the Taoist looked at the black and white chess pieces on the chessboard. His right hand stretched out in the air and kept plucking, as if he was playing the zither or playing in the spring breeze. Suddenly, his index finger slightly paused. With this movement, a matte black chess piece jumped out of the chess urn beside the chessboard and fell on the chessboard with a clap, right at the intersection of the vertical and horizontal lines. As the leader of the South School of Haotian Taoism and the nation master of the Tang Empire, it was not surprising that Li Qingshan could play such a move easily. What was strange was that he frowned very hard at this time, as if he was a little afraid of the monk opposite him. The monk called himself Huang Yang and was now stationed in the Wanyan Tower Temple in the southern city of Chang'an. It was said that he once went to an unknown place in the wilderness to cultivate the supreme Buddhism. A few years ago, he met the emperor of the Tang Empire by chance and became his sworn brother. Since then, he was known as the younger brother of the emperor of the Tang Empire. However, this monk pursued ascetic cultivation and usually sat in the Wanyan Tower to recite translated sutras and rarely contacted people outside the temple. Monk Huang Yang quietly looked at the chess pieces on the chessboard. His eyelashes slowly blinked, and a white chess piece slowly rose from the chess urn to the chessboard and then fell slowly without making any sound. It was extremely gentle. The white piece landed and sealed off a certain chi hole. He didn't seem to make any movements, but with a slight shift of his gaze, a black piece that had been eaten was moved outside the chessboard. There were already 7 or 8 pieces there. No one dared to disturb the nation master of Tang and the emperor's younger brother when they were playing chess. The little monks and Taoists were far away from the side of the road and did not have the chance to see the 2 masters playing chess. Otherwise, if they were to see such a marvelous scene, they would definitely be in awe. Li Qingshan looked at the black and white pieces on the chessboard and shook his head. He changed the subject. When His Majesty is in the palace, only one person remains. When His Majesty leaves the palace, there are 2 waiting for him. When did this rule start? Who in this world would dare to do anything to the Tang Emperor? Moreover, His Majesty is going to the academy today. Who would dare to cause trouble in the academy? Huang Yang smiled and looked at him. I don't know. Li Qingshan said in frustration, you should have heard about what happened to Cao Xiaoshu, right? It's such a pity. If he could enter the knowing destiny state more than 10 years ago, we wouldn't have to follow His Majesty as bodyguards every day. Huang Yang shook his head. If he hadn't experienced Jianghu for these years and had the lucky chance to see the lake in the palace, who would dare to say that he could enter the knowing destiny state? Li Qingshan shook his head and said, during those years, you must have been chopping firewood in that temple, so you didn't know the specific situation. Cao Xiaoshu had the chance to enter the academy. With his talent, he would definitely enter the second floor. If he could enter the second floor, he would be fortunate enough to be enlightened by the headmaster. Then it wouldn't be difficult for him to enter the knowing destiny state. Huang Yang was silent for a long time. He said softly, if he could enter the academy and be enlightened by the headmaster, it would be a blessing indeed. Li Qingshan looked at his clean face and suddenly said with a self-deprecating smile, everyone says that we can never meet, but they don't know that we really can't meet the academy. The monk and the Taoist in the pavilion were the Dharma protectors of the orthodox front gate of Buddhism and the leader of the South School of Haotian Taoism. No matter what they thought, their status meant that they would never step into the academy. Just like today, when the Emperor of Tang led his ministers to attend the opening ceremony of the academy, the two most respected supramundane powerhouses of the Tang Empire could only sit quietly in the distance and play chess. When will the headmaster leave? He will leave Chang and after the semester begins. Headmaster, you've worked hard. Huang Yang looked at Li Qingshan quietly and said, I still want to know how tall the headmaster is. After a long silence, Li Qingshan said, my master once said that the headmaster is as tall as several floors. Huang Yang was slightly stunned, and a sincere smile slowly appeared on his face. Then he slightly opened his lips and let out a sigh. The sigh was like the spring breeze passing through the willows, with an indescribable meaning. The second floor is already very tall, but the headmaster is as tall as several floors. That's really tall. After the math test in the morning, Ning Ke, who was complacent and proud before, was suddenly dumbfounded. Sung Sung's worries were very reasonable. A poor lad who was busy eating hot and sour noodles with fried eggs, chatting with girls at the House of Red Sleeves, killing enemies at the Spring Breeze Pavilion in the rain, and worrying about how much he earned today would not have the time to memorize the academy entrance examination questions. Even if he did, it would be useless. He lived in the deep mountains and grasslands all year round and did not know those things. It was not a problem for him to write the article on the response of the Tao from memory, but it was impossible for him to think about other things. Ning Ke did not intend to be a hero who did not answer the questions. That would be too pretentious, just like the younger brother of the royal master in the separation pavilion outside the academy. Therefore, he changed his pen and carefully filled the two papers from beginning to end. As for whether the answers had anything to do with the questions, it was not within his consideration. He only hoped that the instructors of the academy would sympathize with him because of his neat and tidy papers. During the process of answering the questions, he also thought about it carefully, because he knew that his only advantage in these two subjects was probably that his handwriting was much better than others. Therefore, from the beginning of the math test, he put all his attention on the pen and ink, and he deliberately used the hairpin-style small regular script, which he was the least familiar with. He did not use the hairpin-style small regular script to hide anything. Well, it was indeed to hide his gender. He wanted the instructors to think that the owner of the paper was a beautiful, idiotic lady from an official's family who was good at writing, so that they would give him some unspeakable marks. The bell rang again, and the written exam was over. Ning Ke walked out of the examination room disinterestedly, spread his hands to Sang Sang, who was full of expectation, and showed an innocent expression. He accompanied Chu Yuxian, who had come to find him, to have lunch prepared by the academy, and then began to prepare for the Wushu test in the afternoon. Ning Ke was very confident about the 3 exams in the afternoon. Therefore, Facing the eager eyes of the instructors of the academy and the examiners of the Ministry of Rites, as well as the room full of musical instruments, he did not hesitate to give up. I'm not a musician in the House of Red Sleeves, and I don't know how to play the flute. Thinking of these stupid words angrily, he followed the crowd of candidates to the lawn outside the academy. On the lawn, there were dozens of military horses, and the captain of the military ministry stood beside them, looking at the eager or pale students indifferently. The course of archery was about archery, and the course of driving was free to choose whether to ride a horse or drive a carriage. Of course, Ning Ke chose to ride a horse. He had been dealing with horses and arrows all these years on the grassland of the city of Wei, so he believed that he would not be worse than anyone else. On the lawn in the distance, Sang Sang, who was holding a big black umbrella, clenched her small fist and encouraged him. He smiled, cheered himself up, and walked to the field. When the candidates of the academy entrance examination were about to take the last 3 exams, in a spacious and clear room in the academy, the instructors were gathered around to mark the papers of the 3 exams in the morning. Most of the instructors were white-haired and had experienced such scenes many times, so they were naturally not nervous. They held a teapot and smoked a pipe, leisurely, occasionally dropping ink to mark, and occasionally raising their heads to chat with their peers. An instructor commented on the difficulty of today's papers. This year's academy entrance examinations were set by eldest senior brother. He has a gentle temperament, so naturally it won't be too difficult. If it was still set by second senior brother like last year, who knows if a large number of people would have fainted from crying today. It's fine if it's etiquette and calligraphy, but this question in mathematics is purely a gift. Everyone knows that the headmaster of the academy is a wine addict. A pot of wine is half, and then the other half becomes a drop. Is the headmaster of the academy going to use his sword to cut the drop of wine into half? How can so many candidates get such a simple mathematics question wrong? I really don't know what their brains are made of. An instructor asked curiously, "It's not simple, but I'm more concerned about how many pots of wine did the headmaster of the academy drink when he first entered the Westhill Divine Mountain? How many pounds of peach blossoms did he pluck?" Someone laughed and said, "The headmaster of the academy drank 7 big pots of wine that spring and plucked all the peach blossoms from the Westhill Divine Mountain." But there is a legend that the headmaster of the academy was the one who drank wine, but the one who plucked all the peach blossoms from the Westhill was the youngest uncle who followed the headmaster of the academy. I also think that the headmaster of the academy is more elegant, and the youngest uncle's violent personality is more suitable. At the mention of the youngest uncle, the instructors were silent for a while and then returned to normal. Someone laughed and said, "But the peach trees on the lawn of the academy were planted by the headmaster of the academy himself." Every time the old Taoist priests from the Westhill Haotian Palace came, their faces looked worse than if their mothers had died. I really think the headmaster of the academy is very bad. The instructors in the marking room laughed. Mocking the world's most sacred Westhill Divine Palace was like a daily routine for them, and their laughter was very arrogant. It must be said that the academy in the south of Chang was really a wonderful place. The instructors gradually stopped laughing and began to focus on marking the papers. An instructor looked at the ink scroll in his hand and read aloud, "The headmaster of the academy drank 2 pots of wine and plucked all the peach blossoms from the mountain." The answer is correct. I noticed that this candidate named Ning Ke answered the fastest, so he can be ranked A. I have no objection to the A grade, but I have a question. Why did the candidate answer 2 pots of wine instead of 2 pots of wine? Or is this his personal habit? Or is there something special about the 2 words? It's really puzzling. Chapter 76. The instructors shook their heads, indicating that they did not understand. Thus, someone became interested in the candidate named Ning Ke and took out his 2 test papers from the course of etiquette and the course of calligraphy. The instructor was curious to see if the candidate could enter grade A again, but unexpectedly, he saw 2 big, beautiful, but empty test papers. He could not help but slap the table heavily in annoyance and pass the test papers to everyone to see. He sighed regretfully and said, "Over the years, who has ever seen such a beautiful and neat test paper and such perfect hairpin-style small regular script? But who has ever seen such an ignorant and incompetent candidate? He must be ranked at the bottom of grade D. I'm so angry." One of the instructors shook his head in appreciation and said with a smile, "Although what he wrote is nonsense, this hairpin-style small regular script is really pleasing to the eye. Just based on this handwriting, he should be promoted to grade." "No way." The instructor, who was the first to feel pity for Ning Kei, said angrily, "A male candidate wrote such beautiful hairpin-style small regular script. His intention is obvious. What does he want to do? He wants to insult the IQs of the academy instructors and challenge the dignity of the academy." A simple examination technique was elevated to the height of IQ and dignity. Naturally, the two test papers were treated as garbage and placed at the bottom of grade D. At this time, Ning Kei did not know that he had been sentenced to death for calligraphy and etiquette, but he was very clear that he could not get a good score in these two subjects. Now that he had given up on music, whether he could pass the academy entrance examination and become an official student of the academy, it all depended on whether he could get a high score in archery and driving, and it had to be the highest. Occasionally, horses neighed on the lawn of the academy. Candidates entered the examination room one by one with their number plates and were randomly matched with military horses. The Tang Empire was a country of martial arts. Unsurprisingly, most of the candidates chose to ride horses instead of driving. The examinees who didn't get their turn stood outside the fence and watched attentively. They watched some examinees gallop elegantly, some examinees fall awkwardly on the grass, splashing mud all over their bodies, and some military horses neighing and jumping. If it weren't for the military captains hurriedly intercepting them, the examinees would probably be kicked and injured. The examinees roughly understood that there was still some element of luck in the driving course exam. If you could randomly pick a docile and healthy warhorse, your chances of passing would naturally be higher. But if you picked a stubborn and bad-tempered warhorse, you'd be lucky if you didn't fall off. Since they were going to be used as mounts for the academy's entrance exam, the military ministry had done some sorting in advance. Most of the horses looked strong and disciplined. They stood quietly at the side, looking at the green grass under their feet and the peaches and apricots outside the fence. They did not make any inappropriate movements. There was a black stallion on the lawn that attracted the gazes of all the examinees, vigilant, uneasy, and even frightened gazes. 3 examinees had already been thrown off by that violent wild horse. After a female examinee wearing a red outfit was thrown off the lawn, the wild horse actually tried to use its hooves to trample on her. At that time, the scene could be said to be full of danger. The expressions of the candidates who had yet to enter the arena darkened when they saw the tearful female candidate in red being supported outside the barrier. They prayed silently to Haotian, and even asked Buddha to pray that they would not encounter that wild horse. When the results of the random drawing came out, the candidates who were waiting to enter the field finally breathed a sigh of relief. Then, they all cast sincere looks of sympathy on the poor guy. There would always be someone unlucky, and the unlucky one would always be the hero. This was probably the principle of how one could not see the rainbow without experiencing the wind and rain. Under the sympathetic gaze, Ning Kei slowly walked into the lawn surrounded by wooden fences. His expression was very calm, but he was silently cursing in his heart. With the skills he had honed on the grassland, it was naturally easy for him to teach a stubborn wild horse a lesson. However, he was worried that he would not have enough time to train the horse since he wanted to get a high score in the driving course. All the horses on the lawn were equipped with bit, and the black stallion was no exception. But surprisingly, the black stallion leaned against the railing and refused to move no matter how hard the captain pulled it. It stretched its head to the peach tree outside the railing, and with a roll of its tongue, it swallowed a few peaches and chewed them, completely ignoring the inconvenience of having the bit in its mouth. The black horse chewed on the pink peaches and shook its head and tail from time to time. It looked extremely happy, as if it deserved a beating. The captain in charge of looking after the horse wiped the sweat from his forehead and helplessly spread out his hands. He said to Ning Kai with sympathy, "No one knows what's wrong with this horse today. It seems to be a bit infatuated with love. Be careful yourself." After the captain stepped out of the fence, Ning Kai walked to the side of the black horse's neck and reached out his hand to pat its thick neck. The black horse squinted at him impatiently, its eyes full of contempt and dissatisfaction. Ning Kai had hundreds of good methods on how to train a horse, but he had to fight for time. So he pretended not to see the black horse's provocative eyes and said with a smile, "Big black horse, be nice to me." The lad smiled with dimples and looked very innocent. He said in a very innocent tone, "Or I'll kill you." The black horse suddenly became fearful and uneasy. It did not know why a casual threat from the youth next to it had turned it into a pathetic wooden horse. It only felt a very real cold killing intent. The long mane on its neck was ruffled by the wind, its forehooves suddenly became stiff, and the pinkish peach blossoms fell from its slightly opened mouth. Warhorses could not understand human language, but they could understand human nature. Especially warhorses that had been on the battlefield for a long time, they could feel the real killing intent and the real danger. Ning Kai killed people at the age of 4, 5, 6, and 16. He killed people from Chang and to Min Mountain, the city of Wei, the grassland, Shubi Lake, and back to Chang and. No one knew how much blood had been spilled and how many heads had flown under his knife. The woodchopper of Shubi Lake had run amok on the grassland. Even the most powerful wild horse leader had to surrender to him. Humans might not be able to feel the danger from Ning Kai, but horses could, especially when he said he would kill you. There was a burst of exclamation outside the fence. Whether it was the examinees who were ready to go on the field or the captains who were vigilant to ensure the examinees' safety, they all looked at a corner of the lawn, their eyes full of shock and disbelief. On the other side of the lawn, Ning Kai was leading the big black horse to the starting line. The big black horse, which had been unusually naughty and violent before, was now quiet and obedient like a well-trained handmaiden. Standing on the grassland in the distance, Sang Sang put the big black umbrella under her buttocks and yawned with her hand covering her mouth. Her little face was full of boredom. She was probably the only person in the world who never worried about her young master's life. Chapter 77. In reality, lightning was white. Occasionally, there would be purple, but never black. Today, on the lawn outside the academy, everyone saw a black bolt of lightning. The examinees looked at the black horse that was as swift as an arrow, leaping out of the herd of horses in an instant, galloping forward at a terrifying speed that no one could catch up to. They thought of the disheveled examinees who had been thrown off by the horse's hooves, and thought of the red-clothed young lady who had tears on her face as she stood outside the fence, and couldn't help but be shocked speechless. Their eyes subconsciously followed the black lightning and saw Ning Kai, who was sitting on the back of the big black horse, bowing slightly like a falling leaf. They could not understand what this young candidate had done to the naughty black horse to make it so obedient and show such amazing strength. The meadow outside the academy was vast, covering an area of many acres. However, the examination area surrounded by fences was not very large. Everyone was still in shock. It seemed that the girl in red had just raised her right hand to cover her open mouth in surprise when the driving test abruptly ended. To be more precise, the black horse had reached the finish line ahead of the rest of the examinees by nearly half the time with an incredible speed. Ning Kai jumped off the horse's back and wiped off a few drops of sweat on his forehead. He turned around and patted the big black horse's thick neck with satisfaction, and then heavily patted its thick buttocks. He waved his hand and left. When the big black horse saw that Ning Kai signaled it to leave, it suddenly felt that it had escaped from the horrible blood swamp and returned to the happy human world. It neighed happily and rubbed against Ning Kai's shoulder to please him. Then, it hurriedly kicked its hooves and left, not daring to look back. It seemed to be even faster than during the exam. The candidates at the entrance of the fence looked at Ning Kai in silence, as if they were looking at a monster. Many people wanted to ask him how he did it, but did not dare to ask because of the strangeness he had shown earlier. Ning Ke felt the strange gazes from all around and frowned slightly. He slightly lowered his eyes without looking sideways, and walked directly to the academy entrance exam area. It was not his original intention to attract the attention of the surrounding examinees and even the instructors. Showing off his talent for vanity was also not in line with his ideas. However, he knew that his results in the 3 subjects were a mess. If he did not perform well in the last 2 subjects, he would definitely not be able to pass the entrance exam. He had prepared for years, spent so much money, abandoned his military status, and rushed thousands of miles from the grassland to Chang'an. But in the end, he could not enter the academy. It was really a sad D minor serenade. No matter what, he could not accept such an ending. What was the point of being in the limelight? Just as he was about to leave the driving course, a young girl blocked his way. The young girl had thick eyebrows and bright eyes. She could be considered pretty. She wore a large red robe with a tight belt. Her youthful body was extremely taut and gave off a refreshing feeling. However, the tear stains on her face made her look somewhat delicate and pitiful. How did you do it? The red-clothed girl asked angrily. Why doesn't it listen to me? Ning Ke thought for a while and answered seriously, maybe I have a better character? Character? The girl in the arrow robe was stunned and immediately said angrily, what do you mean? I mean luck. Ning Ke spread his hands and smiled innocently. Then he politely asked her to step aside and trotted to the driving course examination room. The girl in the arrow robe was stunned. As the daughter of Yunhui General, she was beautiful and straightforward. It could be said that everyone in Chang'an knew her. No one dared to answer her perfunctorily. So when Ning Ke ran far away, she came to her senses and turned to look at the back of the lad. She stamped her feet and asked, who is this guy? At this time, a group of examinees surrounded the examination room and were talking about Ning Quebec. One of the young men came to the side of the girl in the arrow robe and said, someone just looked at the register. This lad is called Ning Quebec. He is recommended by the military ministry. He should have no extraordinary background. Miss Situ, you don't have to pay attention to him. The girl in the arrow robe said unhappily, if he has no extraordinary background, then how could he tame that big black horse? Maybe, he is really lucky. The young man replied awkwardly. Another girl in crimson clothes came over and frowned at the lad on the grassy slope in the distance. She shook her head and said, he may be recommended by the military ministry from the frontier fortress. It is not strange that he is good at horsemanship. But you all say he has no extraordinary background, but I don't think so. Today, among hundreds of examinees, only he came with a handmaiden, which made Her Highness embarrassed. It is obvious that this lad is too arrogant and spoiled. Maybe he is the son of a big family in Qinghe Prefecture. Is Qinghe Prefecture great? This is not the array of Taizu Emperor. Miss Situ raised her eyebrows and said, Sister Wuxia, find out the details of that guy. I want to know what is going on. Not far from these Chang and noble girls and childs, there were more than a dozen examinees recommended by the military ministry. One of them, who was in his 30s and came from the southwest border, shook his head and said to his companions, this has nothing to do with luck. Since the lad is recommended by the military ministry like us, he must have served in the army at the frontier fortress. He has been close to horses all year round. Naturally, he has a few knives. But he is too young. As if to prove his assertion, an irritated neigh suddenly sounded in the driving course examination room, followed by panicked shouts. The big black horse that was as gentle as a little handmaiden by Ning Ke's side was kicking violently. A burly examinee fell on the lawn in a sorry state, looking extremely embarrassed. Ning Ke did not know what the examinees in the driving examination room were talking about him. If he knew that his military companion praised him for having a few knives, he would probably praise himself silently in his heart, "I have 3 knives." In addition to knives, horses, and bows and arrows, the skills he was best at in his life were probably the skills he had honed in order to survive in the forests and grasslands. With only 1 knife and a quiver of arrows, he was confident that he could fight with a cultivator in the lower state of see-through. If he could survive, it would be very easy for him to pass the exam of toxicology. Toxicology was different from driving. There was no need to compare the scores of other examinees to make a judgment. That was why he had tried his best in the driving examination room, trying to get as far away from other examinees as possible. At this time, he drew his bow and aimed at the target 100 steps away, but he did not think too much about it. He only wanted to hit 10 rings with each arrow. If those examinees whose foreheads were drenched in sweat and whose arms were trembling from nervousness while drawing their bows knew that this fellow's minimum requirement was to hit 10 points with each of his arrows, they would probably die from anger. But that was what Ning Ke thought and did. He pulled the bow, placed the arrow, and loosened his fingers. As the bowstring moved, the standard feather arrow of the Tang military would shoot out and accurately hit the bullseye on the target. As soon as the first arrow hit the bullseye, he had already taken out the second arrow from the quiver on his back. He repeated the action of drawing the bow and loosening his fingers. The arrow once again brushed the hard bone ring on his finger and hit the bullseye without any surprise. His movements were not fast, and the target 100 paces away did not show any miraculous scene of a lightning bolt piercing through the target or a back arrow splitting the shaft of the front arrow in half. Just like that, he shot arrow after arrow steadily, but gradually formed a kind of beautiful rhythm, the humming of the bowstring like a soothing melody in the spring wind. Ning Ke's calm demeanor, impeccable posture, rhythmic movement of the bowstring, and extremely accurate archery. As the number of arrows in the quiver decreased, Ning Ke gradually attracted more and more people's attention. More and more people gathered behind him, including candidates, instructors of the academy, and even 2 generals from the military ministry who came for inspection. At this time, in the eyes of the crowd, the lad who stood on the lawn and drew his bow seemed to have turned into a calm soldier who had been on the battlefield for a long time and would not blink even if thousands of cavalry came rushing at him. The general watched Ning Ke shoot the last arrow and said to the attendant beside him, "Find out which general taught this lad. If he can't enter the academy this time, immediately return him to the military." After a short pause, the general rubbed his gray hair and said in a low voice, "Keep it a secret. His original troop will definitely call him back. We, the Yulin Royal Guards, have to steal him." At dusk, His Majesty and Her Majesty had already returned to Chang and City, leaving only the prince and various department chiefs to preside over the remaining parts. The 6 exams had finally ended and it was time to publish the results. Hundreds of examinees stood quietly on the wide stone platform, tiptoeing and craning their necks to look at the empty screen wall. They were like hundreds of large geese that had been starving for days, stretching their long necks, waiting to be fed by someone. Several instructors of the academy slowly walked out of the building and bowed slightly to the prince. After the officials of the Ministry of Rites confirmed it, the instructors stepped on the wooden table, dragged a bucket of rice milk, and casually pasted a piece of red paper on the screen wall. The sound of waves roared. Hundreds of examinees were like hundreds of big geese who had finally seen their food. They could no longer suppress their emotions and rushed toward the screen wall. Ning Ke held Sang Sang's cold little hand and was pushed around by the crowd. But in the end, he still managed to fight his way out and squeezed to the bottom of the screen wall. The first thing he saw was the list of etiquette and calligraphy. At the bottom of the paper, he found his name. Ning Ke, the last in the D class. The results of calligraphy were the same. He rubbed his head in annoyance and muttered to himself, "It can't be. Even if I answered blindly, I wrote so many words, and my handwriting is so good. Could it be that the examiner who corrected my paper was a female examiner?" Someone behind him could not help but burst into laughter and ridiculed. "I thought he was a genius like the 3rd young master of the South Jin Kingdom. It turns out that he is just an uneducated man with only martial arts skills." It was the girl in the arrow robe who laughed at him. She was probably unwilling, so when the results were announced, she left her companions and desperately squeezed to Ning Kei's side. She wanted to see what kind of flower this guy would be. Ning Kei did not know that this noble lady of Cheng and was Situilan, the daughter of Yunhui General. He stared at her with great boredom, turned around and squeezed out of the crowd with Sang Sang's little hand. The girl in the arrow robe turned around in surprise and shouted at his back, "Don't you want to see the results?" Ning Kei did not look back and calmly said, "A+." The girl in the arrow robe and the people around her heard this and were so shocked that they almost fell to the ground. They thought, where did this guy come from? How could he be so confident and arrogant that he knew he would get A+ without even looking at the results? Sang Sang raised her little face and gave him a puzzled look. Ning Kei looked at her and explained with a smile, "They are not as good as me at pretending to be deep and cool." Chapter 78. Ning Kei squeezed out of the crowd with Sang Sang, but did not leave. He stood at a corner of the academy's stone ground and watched the lively scene by the screen wall. He felt a little remorseful and felt that it was meaningless to deliberately act like that before. He did not know whether it was the big black horse or the arrows that made him feel as if he had returned to the grassland or the Shubi Lake, subconsciously feeling a little nervous. In fact, he did not know whether he could pass the exam or not, so he was very nervous. Today's academy entrance examination gathered many young talents from all over the world. If it were not for the black lightning in the driving exam, Ning Kei, who was dressed in ordinary clothes, would not have attracted much attention. At this time, he was far away from the crowd, so naturally no one cared about him. The examinees' attention was still on their own scores and those who were already quite famous before the academy entrance examination. For example, Wang Ying from Linchuan, who was personally sent back by the instructors of the academy from a remote village. Although he was only 14 years old, his etiquette and literature had caused a sensation in Cheng a few days ago. Another example was Zhong Dajuan, a gifted scholar from a famous school in Yangguan. However, Wang Ying was still young, and Zhong Dajuan's fame in the southern Tang was due to his poetry. Therefore, most examinees favored the third son of the Xia family from Ruyang in the South Jin Kingdom. The Xia family of the South Jin Kingdom was a 1,000-year-old family, which was famous for its poetry. The third son, Xia Qingyun, was intelligent since childhood. He could write at the age of 3 and write poems at the age of 5. During his growth, he made friends with many famous scholars. The elders in the Xia family appreciated his talent and spared no expense to invite talents from all over the world. Thus, he became famous today. Xia Qingyun was only 18 years old this year, but he was already the Tanhua of the South Jin Kingdom's imperial examination. After the imperial examination, he insisted on quitting his official position in the South Jin Kingdom and traveled thousands of miles north to the Tang Empire in order to enter the academy. Although the academy's enrollment was strict, it would be too unbelievable if the Tanhua of the South Jin Kingdom could not enter. Therefore, no one doubted whether Xia Qingyun could pass the exam, but only cared about whether he could get the first place. At this time, Xia Qingyun, Zhong Dajuan, and Linchuan Wang Ying were standing under the screen wall, looking up at the list with their hands behind their backs. Zhong Dajuan, dressed in a black robe, showed an indifferent expression on his face. He knew that his result in the second course of driving and archery could only be average, and it was impossible for him to win the first place. The 14-year-old Linchuan Wang Ying's immature face was inevitably a little nervous, but Xia Qingyun, dressed in a starry white robe, was very calm, with a confident smile on his handsome face that matched his talent. The girl in the arrow robe and the girl named Wuxia, as well as several children of influential families in Cheng'an, stood behind them and giggled in low voices. Several hardy girls pointed at Xia Qingyun without any taboo. The crowded crowd consciously left a large empty space around these young men and women, as if they were afraid to disturb or collide with them. The Tang Empire had strict laws, but the distinction between social classes was not too strict. However, the 7 or 8 young men and women standing under the screen wall at this time had extraordinary family backgrounds and their own reputations, so the rest of the people subconsciously kept a distance from them. Soft exclamations of admiration sounded from time to time under the screen wall. Every time the names of the 3 people were found at the top of the list, it would lead to a burst of whispers. Looking at the backs of the 3 talents standing in front of them, they were full of envy. Linchuan Wangying turned back and shyly greeted the candidates with hands folded in front. Except that he only got a C in the course of archery because of his young age, he got an A+ in the course of music. It was said that he played the zither in the course of music in the morning, which won a very high evaluation from Qinyu Fengsheng, the instructor of the academy. Zhong Dajuan slightly raised his chin and casually cupped his hands to greet the candidates behind him. He seemed a little proud. However, the Tang people had always been free and easy. As long as you had the right to be proud, you would never be stingy with your own praise. Except that Zhong Dajuan only got a B in the course of riding and archery, the other 4 subjects were all ranked A, especially the course of calligraphy, which also got an A+. Such an excellent result was indeed worthy of applause. The warmest applause and the most enthusiastic eyes of the female candidates were naturally given to Xia Qingyun, the 3rd young master of the Xia family from the South Jin Kingdom. He got 6 A's, including 2 A+ in the course of etiquette and calligraphy. Such a perfect result could be ranked in the top few even in the academy entrance examination in the past 10 years. Xia Qingyun cupped his hands to greet the crowd around him and smiled. The twilight shone on the young talent's white robe and his handsome face and modest smile, which was extremely dazzling. The girl in the arrow robe and her female companions kept clapping their hands and jumping for joy, as if it was also their honor. In the distance, Ning Ke and Sang Sang stood side by side. Looking at the lively scene, he could not help but sneer, "I really don't understand why. Is that so-called 3rd young master more beautiful than others?" This was just a common saying in the city of Wei. For example, if a soldier drank 2 more bowls of wine than his companions would laugh at him. Why? Is it because you are more beautiful than others? Ning Ke just joked casually, but he did not expect Sang Sang beside him to raise her little face. Her willowy eyes were full of stars after the twilight dispersed. She said, "Indeed very beautiful." Ning Ke was speechless. He looked down at the exposed front of his boots, as if there were ants crawling over it. Under the screen wall, a candidate said excitedly, 6 A's, 2 A's. This should be the best result in the academy entrance examination in the past 10 years. The 3rd young master of the South Jin Kingdom really deserves his reputation. A disappointed candidate replied indignantly, "Who said this is the best result in the past 10 years? 5 years ago, a candidate from West Hill got 6 A's. All the instructors of the academy came out to watch, because it was the best result in 100 years. As soon as this remark came out, the screen wall suddenly quieted down. Xia Qingyun and the other 2 frowned and looked at the place where the voice came from. How could a candidate get 6 A's in the academy entrance examination? This statement was really too shocking. The unknown candidate from West Hill who could get the best result in the academy entrance examination in 100 years was enough to beat all the so-called geniuses in the world to death. Why haven't we heard of that candidate from West Hill? The previous person asked with some unwillingness. The candidate gave him a sneer and said, after that candidate from West Hill completed the academy entrance examination, he did not take any other assessment and was directly summoned to the 2nd floor by the dean. He should have been studying on the 2nd floor in the past 5 years. Secular mortals like you and me, how could we have heard of him? The candidates under the screen wall exclaimed in unison, guessing who the unknown candidate from West Hill was. First, he got the best result in 100 years, and then he was directly summoned to the 2nd floor in less than a day after he entered the academy. Hearing that the candidate from West Hill had entered the 2nd floor, the 3rd young master of South Jin Kingdom raised his eyebrows higher, and his eyes began to show a dignified look. All those who became famous at a young age always had a bit of arrogance in their hearts. Last year, he got the 3rd place in the South Jin Kingdom, which was unacceptable to him, so he chose to come to the academy to prove himself. Of course, his ultimate goal was the extremely mysterious 2nd floor of the academy in the rumors, but he did not expect that he was much slower than that person. The girl beside the girl in the arrow robe was Jin Wuxia, the youngest daughter of the Chancellor of Tang Kingdom. She had a mild temperament since childhood and loved poetry and books. She had long heard of the name of the 3rd young master of South Jin Kingdom. These days, she had met and talked with him in the poetry meeting in Chang and restaurant and found that he was indeed very talented. At this moment, she looked at his expression and said with a smile, "The 3rd young master has 6 A's, and 2 A's, which is also a very rare achievement. At least this time, no one can beat him." That's right. In this year's academy entrance examination, Zhong Dajuan of Yangguan got A's in calligraphy, Wang Ying of Lin City got A's in music, and the 3rd young master Xia got A's in both subjects. Who can do better than the 3 of you? The candidates on the screen wall all agreed. Xia Qingyun's expression became slightly better, and he laughed at himself and saluted again. The girl in the arrow robe was about to accompany her female companion to talk with the 3rd young master. Suddenly, she thought of one thing. Thinking of the guy's cool declaration when he left, she subconsciously looked up at the top of the screen wall again. She silently thought that the guy must be afraid of losing face, so he talked nonsense. But thinking of the black lightning in the driving course examination, she somehow believed that she would see the guy's name at the top. The name of the guy was not at the top of the course of music. No, his name was not on the whole list of the course of music. It seemed that the guy was really ignorant and incompetent. Lon Lon, you are really a fool, and you actually believe that nonsense. Situi Lan, the daughter of the Yunhui general, angrily pulled the short hem of her arrow robe. She did not want to continue to search for the name, but her eyes uncontrollably moved to both sides. Oh. She stared at the top of the list of the 3 subjects of mathematics, driving and archery. Looking at the same name, she thought that she was dazzled. Her red lips slightly opened and she subconsciously read, Ning K, the top A's. The top A's. Or the top A's? Following her voice, the congratulatory voices of the examinees below the screen wall gradually became softer. Previously, the examinees would only look for their own names, and then look at the names of those scholars who were already famous. Very few people would pay attention to the nameless people on the roll, so naturally they didn't notice those similar names. 3 A's? Someone looked up at the screen wall in shock and exclaimed aloud. Jin Wuxia covered her mouth and was at a loss. Thinking of the words she had heard before, she said inconceivably, "It turns out that what the guy said was true." He knew that he would definitely get A's. Previously, everyone was still praising the 3rd young master of the South Jin Kingdom who got 2 A's and said that he must be the best in this academy entrance exam. Who could have thought that before the praises stopped, a guy who got 3 A's appeared like this? Who is Ning K? Who is Ning K? The candidates who had not seen the scene of the black lightning anxiously asked their companions around them. The candidates who had seen the scene began to talk about the legendary scene of the big black horse changing from a fierce wife to a well-behaved servant with relish. Situi Lan was looking around for Ning K and found him standing in the distance. She hurriedly took Jin Wuxia's hand and pushed the crowd to run over there. Xia Qingyun and the other 2 seemed to be forgotten at this time. He laughed at himself with a touch of indifference flashing in his eyes. He reached out to invite Zhong Dajuan and Wang Ying to go with those noble ladies of Chang'an. The candidates under the screen wall automatically separated to make a path, like a tide, and then gathered together. They followed them to the corner of the stone platform, to the candidate called Ning K whom they had never heard before. Ning K did not know what happened at the screen wall. He was lowering his head to discuss with Sang Sang what to eat in the shop at night. Suddenly he found a commotion in the crowd, and then the girl in the arrow robe rushed in front of him. Situilan stared at him and asked, 3 A's, how did you get the A's? Ning Ke was startled. Looking at the growing crowd in front of him, he replied, I reviewed very carefully. Sang Sang looked up at him with her willow-like eyes full of confusion. She thought, young master, do you know what reviewing is? Chapter 79. It was dusk, and the golden light turned the mountain behind the academy into a very high altar. There seemed to be warmth in the cracks of the bluestone stones on the stone platform, urging people to go back. However, the candidates who already knew the results of the academy entrance test did not leave. They surrounded a corner of the stone platform and looked at the seemingly ordinary young candidate. Occasionally, they would pay attention to the little handmaiden beside him and whisper to each other from time to time. The candidates had complicated looks in their eyes. Some were puzzled, and some were shocked. There was a candidate who got 3 A+ grades in the academy entrance test and surpassed the 3rd young master of South Jin Kingdom. No one had heard of him before. He was a complete nobody. The young candidate might have been recommended by the military ministry, or he might have honed his skills on the grassland at the frontier fortress. However, he also got an A+ grade in mathematics. Xie Qingyun, Zhong Dajuan, and Wang Ying, the 3 candidates who had high hopes, only got an A grade in this subject. Some candidates who were quick to talk could not help but raise their doubts, and some people immediately responded. Situilan tidied up the front robe that she had pulled and frowned at Ning Quebec. She asked, how did you pass the mathematics exam? Her words were full of doubt and confusion, and her tone was a little tough and defiant. Ning Ke was a little unhappy when he heard it. However, looking at the girl's expression, he was sure that she had no malice. She was just a typical confused girl who was overwhelmed by unexpected news. Therefore, he spread out his hands and smiled innocently without answering. The military ministry had selected more than 70 candidates this year, which had already made many people unhappy in Chang and city. Now that Ning Ke had overshadowed most of them, seeing that he did not answer, the boys and girls in Chang and city began to discuss about Situilan's question. As candidates recommended by the military ministry, they got the first place in 3 subjects. Of course, those candidates who came from the frontier fortresses and camps of the Tang Empire felt very proud. However, they were older than the other candidates on average, so they behaved and spoke calmly. Although they were on Ning Ke's side, they were not in a hurry to say anything. However, a young master of Chang and city could not stand it anymore. Chu Yuxian walked to Ning Ke, waving his fan. He put his hand on Ning Ke's shoulder and stared at those candidates. He said, what's there to be unhappy about? Ning Ke is my friend. Do you know who he is? He was the kind of person who could go to the House of Red Sleeves to drink with prostitutes without having to spend money. Is there anything he can't do in this world? It was said that the most effective way for the young people in Chang and to compete with each other was not to compare whose father's position was higher or whose family made more money. For an open and active society like the Tang Empire, social status and wealth accumulation could change drastically at any time. Moreover, it was too vulgar and tasteless. What they valued more was one's talent, reputation, and strength, as well as who was the most popular in Chang'an. Of course, if one wanted to make a living in Chang'an, he could not completely leave his family background. But there were always places where one's family background was not so taboo, such as the House of Red Sleeves and the canteens of various departments. Therefore, it became a place where people competed with each other. Chu Yuxian said that Ning Ke didn't have to pay for drinks at the House of Red Sleeves, which was not an insult, but a real show of support for Ning Quebec. Sure enough, after hearing that Ning Ke could go against the House of Red Sleeves, which no one dared to offend, those young men and women of Chang and suddenly changed their expressions and looked at Ning Ke with a sense of awe. Not everyone was shocked by Chu Yuxian's shout. For example, Sang Sang looked up and frowned. She stared at young Master Chu's trembling hand on young Master's shoulder and listened to him talking about young Master's visit to the brothel. She was not in a good mood at all. And Situilan looked at Ning Ke in a weird way. I'm still not convinced. There's only one big question in the math exam. If you're right, and if you're wrong, you're wrong. The headmaster of the academy has drunk several pots of wine and cut several pounds of plums. It's impossible for him to have several answers. Then why are you A+, while Mr. Xia is only A+? Situilan held Jean Wuxi's little hand and shouted. She was very reluctant. She was not an unruly and unreasonable person, but she knew that her female companion Jean Wuxi admired the third young master of the South Jin Kingdom. At this time, the third young master's limelight was completely overshadowed by Ning Ke, and Jean Wuxi looked a little gloomy, so she could not help but ask a few more questions. In addition, there was a more important reason that she probably did not realize. In the driving course examination, she was thrown to the ground by the big black horse and her face was almost trampled. As the daughter of the Yunhui general, she could not even deal with a horse, which was extremely embarrassing. Then Ning Ke tamed the big black horse so easily and got the only A+ result in the driving course, which was really incomprehensible to her. The A+ result in the math course was even more incomprehensible to her. Since she could not understand it, she was naturally unwilling to accept it. At this moment, an old voice suddenly sounded in the crowd. Because he was the first one to hand in the math exam. Those who can't answer such an idiotic question are even worse than idiots. Then, the grading can only be based on speed. When I was grading the paper, the cinnabar hadn't even melted yet, and he already answered, so he got an A+. Student, please let me pass. An old woman in a blue cloth gown, holding a bamboo broom in her hand, appeared at a corner of the stone ground. She stooped and slowly swept away the dust under the feet of the crowd. Then she slowly walked out. Looking at the back of the old woman disappearing into the depths of the academy, the examinees were stunned and speechless. In fact, at least 4 out of 5 examinees could not answer this math exam, but the old woman said that it was a question that even an idiot could answer. Someone could not help but say angrily, "Who does she think she is?" A teacher in charge outside the crowd coldly replied, "She is the only female honorary professor in the academy. Those among you who are admitted to the academy will be in her hands for the next few years in the math exam." Is she the second professor? Ning Ke looked at the stooped old woman in the distance, trying hard not to laugh in his heart. Xia Qingyun, the third young master of the Xia family in the South Jin Kingdom, had completely calmed down. Although he was young and aggressive, he was still the first in the overall score of the academy entrance exam. Moreover, his goal and vision were not exactly the same as those ordinary examinees. He was more concerned about how to enter the second floor of the academy. The young examinee in front of him should be an ordinary person, so it was very meaningless to argue with him on these things. On the contrary, after hearing the old woman's words, he could not help but secretly admire Ning Ke for getting the answer in such a short time. He earnestly asked, for the math question, I first used the method of exhaustion, and then came up with an infinite number. Finally, I figured out the reason behind it. I wonder if this is, Situilan whispered Ning Ke's name in his ear. Xia Qingyun nodded to express his gratitude. He looked at Ning Ke and continued to say, I wonder how Brother Ning calculated it. Did you use some other algorithm to be so fast? If it was an infinite number at a glance, why did I use exhaustion at the beginning? As for the last answer, in fact, I was too lazy to push it to the end, so I just wrote down the number. Ning Ke's answer was very irresponsible, like Mr. Almost Same. But in fact, he was not talking nonsense. The so-called conversion between the concept of infinity and precise values was nothing more than irresponsible ambiguity. Many people did not understand. Some thought that Ning Ke had hit the jackpot, and some thought that Ning Ke was hiding something. Only Xia Qingyun seemed to understand, but when he was about to ask further, the voice of the instructor of the academy called the roll in the distance. Xia Qingyun, Wang Ying, Ning Ke, Chen Simiao, He Ying Qin, report to the Department of Magic Skills. Ning Ke was stunned when he heard his name. Report to the Department of Magic Skills. What did that mean? Why did he feel like he was going to the Department of Worship? Why did he feel cold between his legs? But it seemed that it was not convenient to ask others, so he said a few words to Sang Sang, and then followed Xia Qingyun and others to the depths of the academy. He was a little relieved when he found that there was also a female examinee going to the Department of Magic Skills. None of the examinees on the stone ground showed a look of surprise. In fact, the main reason why they did not go home was that they wanted to hear whether their names would be called in the Department of Magic Skills. They looked at those people going to the depths of the academy with envy. Situilan kicked the bluestone cracks in disappointment, looking at Ning Ke's back and muttering in a low voice, "Why did all the good things go to this guy?" It did not take long for those 7 or 8 examinees to come back from the depths of the academy, as if they had just gone for a stroll. Xia Qingyun looked calm, Wang Ying and other examinees could not hide their joy, and only Ning Ke's face showed no expression at all. The academy set up a special course in addition to the 6 courses to cultivate students with potential for cultivation. In the future, those students would be exposed to the art of sword and talisman, so it was called the Course of Magic Skills. The instructors thought that those students who were called before had potential, and they went to receive a psyche power examination. The reason why Ning Ke was selected was related to the hairpin-style small regular script he left on the ink scroll today and his quick response to the math questions. The academy thought that he should have the potential for cultivation, but the instructor who was responsible for the physical examination made a rare failure, and was disappointed to find that his ocean of chi and mountain of snow was blocked. But once again, he experienced the switch between hope and disappointment. If there was no hope, there would be no disappointment. Ning Ke was very clear about his physical condition, so he could face it calmly. Xia Qingyun had already embarked on the road of cultivation when he was in the South Jin Kingdom, so of course there was nothing to be excited about. But Wang Ying and other examinees could hardly suppress their excitement until today when they knew that they might step into the legendary mysterious door. "I can't." Ning Ke spread out his hands and explained to the crowd, "Oh. I can't say I can't. The instructor said that my willpower is fine, but my ocean of chi and mountain of snow is a little weak, and my body is not suitable for cultivation." The academy called 7 people by name, and he was the only one who failed the examination. The examinees on the stone ground looked at him with complicated eyes, and the faint hostility in some eyes turned into sympathy. Of course, there were also a few people whose eyes were full of ridicule. The Tangs respected the strong, but they would not discriminate against the weak. They were tolerant and generous after thousands of years of romance. Situilan, who had been displeased with Ning Ke, looked at him and sighed. She comforted him with sympathy, "Don't be too disappointed. After all, there are only a few people who can cultivate. Look at us, we can't do anything. That makes sense, and not being able to cultivate doesn't mean that we are useless." Ning Ke took the water bottle from Sang Sang and drank a mouthful. He looked at her and said with a smile, "I am a professional woodcutter." After saying this, the master and the servant walked out of the academy in the twilight. Chapter 80. Situilan opened her eyes wide and stared at the lawn burning like wildfire under the setting sun. She stared at the pair of master and servant who were getting further and further away. She couldn't help but put her hands on her waist and murmured, "This guy is really interesting." Ning Ke did not find these things interesting. Arguing with a bunch of kids was just a waste of time and meaningless. What he was thinking now was that according to the curriculum of the academy, there was a lot of free time left for the students. He should use that time to do something meaningful, such as killing people to earn money. Lying on the bed in the old brush pen shop, he looked at the name on the oil paper and asked, "Are you ready?" Sang Sang was oiling the padao she had just polished. She lowered her head and answered, "New cloth covers and old clothes are ready." But young master, what hairstyle are you going to wear this time? Or from the Yueluan kingdom? Ning Ke shook his head and said, you make the decision for such a small matter. Sang Sang raised her head and asked, when are you going to kill him? This guy lives in the eastern city, not far from here. We can kill him whenever we want. Ning Ke looked at the name on the oil paper and the simple information below. He paused and explained, we don't even know when to kill him. When the government investigates the case in the future, it won't be easy to calculate something from the law of time. There is no law in the world. But when you kill more people, there will be a law. Sang Sang sheathed the bright padao in her hand and walked to the bedside to look at Ning Ke's face. She said seriously, this is what you taught me when I was young. No matter how you hide yourself, the government will always find out the reason from the identity of the people you killed. The general's mansion is dead, and the villages in the Yen territory are all slaughtered. Ning Ke smiled and answered, even if the government finally found out that the killer's purpose was to avenge these two things, how could they find me? Maybe they can't find you, young master. But if the government knows who you want to kill, then they can target and protect your targets. They can even directly use those names as bait. At that time, even if you know those people have people from the government around them, won't you kill them? Ning Ke quietly looked at the little handmaiden's eyes and suddenly laughed. He said, you rarely think so much. I'm not really stupid. I'm just too lazy to think. Sang Sang murmured in a low voice. As for why she was willing to think about these things today, she didn't understand. Maybe she didn't understand. Ning Ke understood. So his eyes became a little warm. He looked at her and smiled, I promise you, I'll take a break after killing 2 or 3 people. Then I'll study in the academy. Sang Sang smiled, and her dark face finally showed a relaxed expression. She said, yes, the academy is such a good place. Young master, you can meet so many talents of your age. You should cherish it. Ning Ke was not used to Sung Song's sudden transformation into Shiren. He could not help but roll his eyes. Looking at the roof, he stretched his right hand under the quilt and counted with his fingers. The so-called same age meant that he was actually 7 or 8 years older than them. The next day, the academy officially started classes. Ning Ke and Sang Sang got up early again. After washing and eating, Sang Sang stood at the door of the shop to see them off, while Ning Ke boarded the horse carriage alone. Sang Sang and Ning Ke got up early the next day. After washing and eating, Sang Sang stood at the door of the shop to see them off. Ning Ke boarded the carriage alone. At dawn, the south gate of Chang'an opened. Dozens of carriages with the academy's logo came out one by one. Judging from the number of carriages, most of the students in the academy didn't want to go back and forth and chose to live on campus. They hurried south along the willow-shaded official road. Along the way, they saw flowers, fields, and water. When the curtains were lifted, they saw the steep mountain and the meadow and flowering trees at the foot of the mountain. Although it was the second time Ning Ke saw it, he still couldn't help sighing again. It seemed that such a wonderful fairyland could appear in the human world, in the bustling suburbs of Chang'an. More than 10 black horse carriages climbed on the green meadow and soon arrived at the front gate of the academy. The students got off the carriages one after another and greeted each other with cupped hands. In front of the simple stone gate that was not very eye-catching, there were already many residents who had entered the examination room yesterday to welcome them. The quiet courtyard gate suddenly became lively. The young students all wore the academy's cyan robes. The boys wore black headscarves, while the girls used ebony hairpins to tie up their black hair. Together with the green meadow and the simple stone gate, they looked particularly refreshing. Coupled with the youthful vigor on their faces, a youthful aura spread in all directions as they faced the rising sun in the east. Ning Ke tidied up his cyan robe and took out the small bronze mirror that Sang Sang had put in his bag last night. He checked whether the black headscarf on his head was worn crookedly. After confirming it, he got off the carriage. In yesterday's academy exam, apart from Xie Qingyun and the other two from the South Jin Kingdom. The big black horse who had tamed the big black horse was the most conspicuous one. When the students who were exchanging greetings at the gates saw him, they did not avoid him out of jealousy. Instead, they warmly greeted him and exchanged information about recent events and introduced themselves. The bell in the depths of the academy rang quietly. The students stopped talking and went up the steps in the morning light. The corners of their cyan robes were blown by the morning wind, and their headscarves and hair buns were separated gradually, giving them an inexplicable sense of otherworldliness. Ning Ke, who deliberately slowed down his pace and fell behind the crowd, raised his head in the morning sun and looked at the scene in front of him. His heart slightly moved, but he did not speed up his pace. Instead, he looked more and more carefully at the simple main gate of the academy in front of him that looked like 3 stone pillars and the ordinary buildings around the square above the stone steps. Yesterday, His Majesty of the Academy came in person and the guards of honor were strict. Moreover, he was busy checking the results of the exam, so he did not carefully look at the academy. The academy gave people such a strong sense of otherworldliness, and the half-hidden mountain behind the academy gave people such a strong sense of oppression. But why did he not find anything special here from yesterday to this morning? A few years ago, Ning Ke did not know what the academy was. He only knew how to distinguish the smell of animal urine and how to calculate the flight trajectory of feather arrows. It was not until General Ma of the city of Wei registered for him that he began to gradually know something about the academy, such as its glorious history and countless famous predecessors. He did not know why, but he insisted that the academy in front of him should not be as simple as it looked. It should not be just an educational institution for cultivating talents for the Tang Empire, but should carry a greater meaning. The reason why he had such an understanding was probably related to what he had seen and heard on his journey back from the grassland. Any abandoned disciple of the academy can become a great sword master. Liu Qingchen and Her Highness seemed to be very respectful when they mentioned the academy. But why do the people here look the same as me and I don't see anything special? He adjusted the black gauze headscarf on his head and muttered to himself. At this time, he had already walked through the main gate of the academy alone, crossed the stone ground, and left the main building. He walked in an alley where the morning light had not yet shone. Not far ahead of the alley was the lively study room, and he could faintly hear the excited voices of the students talking to their friends. However, the alley was very quiet. A voice suddenly sounded in the quiet alley. There is no special place in the world. The Imperial Palace is like this, the Haotian Divine Hall is like this, and so are those unknown places. Then what is special about the academy? Hearing this voice, Ning Ke's expression did not change, but his right hand in his sleeve suddenly tightened, ready to take the big black umbrella in the cloth sheath behind him at any time. Living in a difficult environment since childhood, he would instinctively judge any sudden situation as dangerous. A scholar appeared in front of the alley without anyone noticing. This scholar had straight eyebrows and wide eyes, with a simple and amiable expression. He wore an old cotton gown that seemed too thick in the spring, and a pair of broken straw shoes. Both the old cotton gown and the broken straw shoes were covered with dust, as if they had not been washed for many years. But somehow, this person looked unusually clean. From the body to the heart, he was incomparably clean. The scholar held a scroll in his right hand, and a wooden dipper was tied to his waist. Ning Ke's gaze moved back and forth between the scroll and the wooden dipper twice, and finally fell on the scholar's face. His right hand in his sleeve gradually loosened. This was the academy, where no one in the whole world dared to do anything improper here. Moreover, although this scholar was covered with dust, he gave people a feeling of being as clean as a newborn baby. No matter who saw him, they would subconsciously want to be trusted by him, as if everything he said or did should be taken for granted. Ning Ke's body relaxed, but he became extremely nervous, because he felt that he trusted this scholar who had suddenly appeared. For someone like him who had struggled between life and death since he was a child and had decided not to trust anyone for the rest of his life, this kind of unexplainable and irresistible sense of trust was a very terrifying thing. He could not be hostile to this scholar at all. What made him feel even more terrified was that he had a very clear feeling that even if he took out the big black umbrella behind him, there was no way he could pose any threat to the scholar in front of him at all. The scholar in a cotton robe smiled slightly, and his gaze fell on the cloth cover behind Ning Ke, as if he could see what was inside. He patted the wooden dipper at his waist and asked, "The umbrella behind you is not bad, do you want to exchange it?" "How does this person know that there is an umbrella in the cloth cover behind me, and a big black umbrella at that?" Ning Ke felt that his lips and tongue were parched, and he could not speak at all. After a long silence, he firmly shook his head. The scholar sighed with some regret, and walked past him with the scroll in his hand. He did not look at Ning Ke again, and walked to a remote side door of the academy. There was a lonely ox cart parked outside the side door of the academy. The scholar walked to the side of the cart, and very seriously bowed to the carriage, and then sat on the shaft of the cart to pick up the ox whip. An ordinary old man's voice came out from the cart, accompanied by a strong smell of wine. "He doesn't want to exchange with you?" The scholar smiled and shook his head. Then he waved the ox whip, and the ox cart slowly began to move forward. In the spring of the 13th year of Tianxi era, the headmaster of the academy took his eldest disciple on another trip to other countries. He did not know how many pots of wine he would drink on this trip. He would cut a few pounds of plum on a few mountains. Chapter 81. Ning Ke shouldn't feel cold, because the scholar in the cotton robe didn't show any hostility or dangerous aura from head to toe. On the contrary, he was as clean as a lotus and trustworthy as a family member. But he still felt cold, because the scholar could see at a glance that he was carrying an umbrella. The umbrella was big and black, and it was the most important thing to him and Sang, and he wanted to exchange it. The morning sun couldn't shine directly into the alley, so it was a bit cold. Was that why he felt cold? Or could it be that the scholar caused him to trust him for no reason, causing him to feel fear? Ning Ke stood in the alley like an ice sculpture for a long time before he came to his senses. He looked back in confusion but did not see anything. Then he lowered his head and thought about it. He couldn't figure out what had happened, so he decided not to think about it anymore. He shook his head and walked toward the noisy crowd. He didn't know that the legendary headmaster of academy had already left in a carriage. He didn't know that he had missed a historical moment. He didn't know how he had missed the exchange with the scholar. He didn't know that it was the real first lesson. But even if he knew, he wouldn't exchange what he had for what he didn't have. It was not something he would do. The first lesson in the academy was a big one. The students gathered on the cool stone ground and listened to the lecture of a professor in the academy with longing. They imagined their lives in the next 2 or 3 years. Like the academy entrance exam, the curriculum of the academy was also divided into 6 subjects. 200 students were divided into 6 study rooms. The class time was from morning to noon. It didn't seem long, but there were no breaks in between. The 7 lucky students who entered the course of magic skills had to receive relevant lessons from the academy every afternoon. The rest of the ordinary students were free in the afternoon. They could choose to stay in the academy to study or go back to Chang and to indulge in debauchery. The chief professor gently and sincerely suggested that they stay in the academy and study in the old library. The discipline of the academy was very loose. The bell in the depths was the signal, the first bell was an alarm, the second bell was to enter, the third bell was to leave, and the fourth bell was to leave. The time between entering and leaving was the time for the students to study in the study room. The academy required the students to pay attention during this time. They could ask questions but were forbidden to make noise. As for things like cleaning, the students didn't need to worry about it at all. The imperial court spent a lot of money on the academy every year to hire countless housekeepers and housekeepers. The next step was to divide the classes. The academy adopted the simplest and fairest method of drawing lots, which did not care about the examinee's family background or the results of the academy entrance test. That child Xia Qingyun and Zhong Dajuan were assigned to Classroom A, Classroom D, and Ning Ke to Classroom C. Ning Ke went to the teaching room at the side of the field to retrieve his books and classics. He followed the crowd and stared at the wooden sign on the Yenyu corridor. He found Classroom 3's room and looked at the picturesque windows and white walls. He thought about how he would be spending the next few years in this place and how he had finally stepped onto the Qingyun path of the Tang Empire. He felt a little lost. He took a deep breath to calm himself down and stepped over the high threshold. Ning Ke. Sit here. Two surprised voices sounded in the study room at the same time. Ning Ke looked up in astonishment and saw Chu Yuxian waving to him excitedly in the spacious back row of the study room. His face looked a little pale, while Situilan was looking at him excitedly in the front row. Today, the girl wore a blue tight suit under the student's robe with several plum blossoms embroidered on the slanted lapel. Her fair neck was exposed under the slightly open collar. It was like a dream, as if it had been a lifetime. It was indeed a lifetime. This was the most familiar and unforgettable scene, for he seemed to see it every year, and more people would ask him to sit there. Ning Ke stood silently in the doorsill of the study room and forcefully closed his eyes to expel those false and disturbing memories from his mind. He smiled apologetically at Situilan, who had an expectant look on her face, and walked to the back row. He did not know that Miss Situ was the daughter of General Yunhui, but he knew that she must be from a noble family in Chang'an. Although all students in the academy were equal, and he heard that His Majesty came to the school in plain clothes and sat side by side with ordinary poor students, he did not know what kind of trouble it would cause if he had too much contact with such a noble lady. Putting down the heavy books and classics, he looked at Chu Yoxian's pale and thin cheeks and stared at his slightly blue lips. He frowned and asked, "Did you go to the House of Red Sleeves again yesterday?" "I stayed there for a whole night." Chu Yuxian sighed and did not hide anything. He said miserably, "Ning Ke, there is something wrong with this world. I can't figure it out, so I went crazy in the House of Red Sleeves for a whole night." Ning Ke thought of the scholar he met before, and his body was slightly stiff. He asked, "What's wrong?" "I actually got into the academy. That's the biggest problem in this world." Looking at him, Chu Yuxian was extremely distressed and said, "You know, my old man spent 2,000 taels of silver to buy me the qualification for the academy entrance examination. I just came here to get a wife. Yesterday, I just answered the 6 subjects blindly. When the results were released, I didn't even look at my name. But I actually got B+ in 4 subjects." Ning Ke was shocked and speechless. After a long while, he sincerely praised, "You really don't show your true colors." "Not revealing my face, my ass." Chu Yuxian looked as if his old man had died. He said distractedly, "I answered that the headmaster of the academy was drunk and chewed half a mountain of peach blossoms. But I still got B+. It only means that the instructors of the academy are all crazy." Ning Ke thought for a while and guessed, "Could it be that your family spent money?" Chu Yuxian said angrily, "Who has ever heard that people can study in the academy with money? And that old man only paid 2,000 taels of silver. 2,000 taels of silver is only enough for me to stay in the House of Red Sleeves for 4 months. It's not enough for me to do anything." In the faraway Chang'an city, in the depths of a silver shop in the eastern city, a very fat old man was painfully looking at his family's account book. With tears in his eyes, he sighed and said, 200,000 taels of silver. "My dear son, I've sold most of my family's property, hoping that you'll make a name for yourself. You can't let me down." "Who the hell said that the academy doesn't accept money? Those bastards just don't accept small money." Chu Yuxian didn't know that his old man had made a great gamble in order to let him enter the academy. He was still indignant and felt that the instructors of the academy were all crazy. "I've never liked poetry, reading, writing or shooting since I was a child. So I can't play with those young masters and noble ladies in Chang'an City. Fortunately, you were also assigned to classroom 3. Otherwise, I really don't know how to spend the next few years. Chu Yuxian said sadly. Ning Ke noticed that when he said that he didn't like poetry, reading, writing or shooting, he didn't feel ashamed at all. Instead, he seemed to take it for granted and even felt a little proud. He smiled and comforted the only acquaintance in Chang and City, saying, "Since you're already here, just take things as they come. Don't think too much." "You're right." Chu Yuxian looked around at his classmates in the spacious study room. His eyes swept over those slim girls and gradually became happy. "I should get closer to my classmates, so that I can get married in the future." Ning Ke was speechless and too ashamed to answer. Chu Yuxian was a typical open-minded Tang person. Otherwise, he wouldn't have invited Ning Ke to drink and play with girls when he first met him in the brothel. After adjusting his mood, he immediately returned to normal. He picked up the jade pendant with 2 fingers and pointed at the girls in front of him, saying in a low voice, "That gentle girl is called Jin Wuxia, the youngest daughter of the libationer of Tang. She's docile but not easy to deal with, because the libationer is very serious or grumpy. Don't mess with that tall girl, because her surname is Gao, and she has an uncle who works in the palace. That greasy-haired boy is called Chen Zixian. His family runs a bookstore in the West City. He's quite rich. If you and I want to drink and don't have enough money, we can ask him to go with us. As for the short guy beside him, don't bother with him. I heard that he's a student from Chen State. Except for eating and sleeping, he's reading and shooting arrows. He's so boring." Ning Ke was greatly impressed. He thought that a person who was unwilling to enter the academy only took less than half a day to figure out the backgrounds and temperaments of all the 30 or 40 people in the study room. What a spirit he must have. He must be determined to carry on his career of eating, drinking, and playing to the end, and to seek friends and companions in the academy. "Ah, you probably know who the lady in the dress is." "Yes, she's Miss Situilan, the daughter of the famous Yunhui general." Chu Yuxian patted the desk and said quickly like a storyteller, "Brother Ning, I'm very grateful that you left her and came to me. But I have to remind you that you've probably offended this famous noble lady in Chang'an. Don't say that I didn't remind you. Miss Situilan has been riding a horse on the Vermilion Bird Avenue since she was 8 years old. She and a group of girls of the same age, called the Female Army. Over the years, they've shocked many pancake stalls and braised barbecue shops, scared many lecherous men, and kicked many heartless men away. If you offend her, you'll have a hard time in Chang'an. It's just like entering a pancake shop, where there's no delicious fruit." Ning Ke was shocked by the spittle in front of him, and it took him a while to come to himself. He thought that he was not afraid of the Female Army, and Situilan was just a harmless little girl in his eyes, so he did not care about it. Instead, he admired Chu Yuxian's ability and said, "Next time when we go to the House of Red Sleeves, I don't think we should force Chen Zixian to come with us. You can go there and say a few sentences to earn him back." He thought that his words were very appropriate, but Chu Yuxian squinted at him and said with a faint sneer, "In that kind of brothel, you can earn money by saying a few sentences. Who else in the world can do that except you?" Ning Ke's expression froze. He wanted to beat this person to vent his anger, but he managed to suppress it. At this time, the teacher in charge of etiquette had walked in with a serious face. The study room suddenly became very quiet, and the young crows and sparrows flew away. Chapter 82. What is etiquette? This is a very broad and grand proposition, but we can't stop exploring and studying it just because it's a grand proposition, because it's very important. This word is as lofty and untouchable as the firmament, so should we stop casting curious gazes at the firmament? Of course not. We observe the clouds and wind during the day, and observe the stars at night. We want to know what the firmament is, and we want to know what's up there. Such a grand proposition needs to be answered in a way that we can understand. Then our answer must be specific, and we must inquire about the subtlety and the specific details. We look up at the starry sky, watch the stars move, and draw the beautiful and constant lines in our hearts. Finally, it becomes the art of stargazing. What is the firmament? We have to experience and comprehend it from the specific lines, the clouds, the upper edge of the breadth between heaven and earth, and the upper limit of the fluctuation of the primordial chi. It's the same for etiquette. If you want to ask me, what kind of answer will you get if you look into the specifics of etiquette and find the nouns in the embodiment? I can only say my own understanding. The so-called etiquette is the rule. The teacher in charge of the etiquette course was an associate professor of the Academy's etiquette department. He was about 60 years old, and he spoke very slowly and clearly. The content of the lecture was also quite organized. The students in front of their desks were listening very carefully. However, Ning Ke was already drowsy. The clearer the instructor spit out the words, the more he felt the drowsiness in his mind, and the more irresistible it was. He was at the bottom of the Academy's etiquette course in the last grade, and he had never been interested in these contents in his previous life. In recent years, he had been busy writing, meditating, killing, arson, gambling, and sleeping. He was really helpless. In a daze, Ning Ke could not help but wonder how painful it would be if his life in the Academy in the next few years was to waste all the good time in the morning on this cliché. What happened next in the study room saved him from this desperate fantasy. He once again understood that the Academy, which had a high status in the Tang Empire, was not an ordinary place, and the teacher in charge here was indeed not an ordinary person. When the old teacher said that etiquette was the rule, a disapproving voice suddenly rang out in the study room, "Teacher, the Tang Empire's prestige has conquered the 4 seas, and the Holy Son of Heaven has reigned over the world. Re-establishing the book of etiquette does not depend on following the rules." According to the rules of the Academy, students were allowed to ask questions in class, so it was normal for the student to question him. But it was the first day of school after all, so the atmosphere in the study room suddenly became a bit weird. Ning Ke woke up and asked Chu Yuxian, who was sitting on the desk next to him, "Who is it?" The Academy paid particular attention to education without discrimination and teaching students in accordance with their aptitude. Many students who could study in the Academy were from ordinary families, but those who dared to question the teacher in the first class must be from an extraordinary family or thought highly of themselves. The student standing beside the desk was the son of a general. The teacher looked at him coldly and asked, "Then in your opinion, can people live in this world without following the rules?" "Not bad." That general, Huzi, said in a low voice, "The Tang Empire was founded on martial arts, and we rely on ignoring those pedantic rules. As long as we are strong, we will always win. But it doesn't mean that we don't follow the rules." The wrinkles on the teacher's face gradually smoothed out. He looked at the burly student expressionlessly and said, "Do you mean that as long as the fist is bigger, the shit is reasonable?" The student scratched his head awkwardly and said, "It's not wrong to interpret it that way. Just like the Tang Empire, when we attacked the Yan Kingdom, we beat them until they cried for their parents. They even wanted to send the crown prince to Chang'an as a hostage. But how would their emperor dare to be rude to the Tang Empire? He should still be called the Holy Son of Heaven." Ning Ke listened to the teacher's words behind the study room and thought that the student's grades in etiquette would definitely not be higher than his. The teacher slowly walked towards the student, his face still expressionless, but when he walked in front of the student, his voice suddenly rose. He raised his right hand that was like a withered tree trunk, and smashed it down on the student's face. He roared angrily, "Does having a bigger fist make sense? Then it's reasonable for me to hit you now." There was a miserable howl in the study room. The burly general's son did not dare to fight back, either because he was afraid of the Academy's rules or because he respected his teacher too much. He was beaten black and blue by the old teacher in an instant, and the corner of his mouth was bleeding. He looked extremely miserable. After a long time, the teacher finally stopped. He gasped and stared at the general's son, and said gloomily, "If what you said is right, then it's right for me to hit you now, because my fist is bigger than yours." Since the teacher began to beat the general's son, the study room had long been in a mess. The students stood up in shock, but no one dared to stop the teacher who had entered a state of rage. Until then, Situilan discontentedly said, "Teacher, if you think you can hit him because you are better than him, doesn't that prove his previous point of view?" Ning Kei was still sitting beside the desk, but his mouth was wide open. He never thought that he would see such a hot scene on the first day of entering the academy. At this time, when he heard Situilan's rebuttal, he also felt that it was very reasonable. The teacher looked back at Situilan coldly and said, "I just want to prove his reason. Is there a problem?" Situilan tightly pursed her lips, thinking of the nervous exhortations of her father and brothers before entering the academy, but finally she could not bear it. She made up her mind and trembled and said, "Yes, if you think he is wrong, then you should not use his reason to teach him. Since etiquette is the rule, you should use the rule to bind him and punish him." The teacher sneered and looked at her and said, "General Yunhui has never read a book in his life, but he has taught his daughter well. But as far as I know, although the two generals' mansions have a good relationship, you have no contact with him. This has nothing to do with friendship." Situilan suppressed her shame and anger, looked up and stubbornly said, "I only talk about reason." "Well, I will talk about reason with you." The teacher looked at the students in the study room and said, "No matter General Yunhui or any other general, even if their fists are bigger than mine and their power is stronger than mine, they still dare not to hit me. Why? Because I am the teacher of the academy, and this is the rule of the Tang Empire." Behind the study room, Chu Yuxian whispered timidly, "Why is the academy in a mess?" But Ning Kei, don't be impulsive and provoke this teacher. Of course, Ning Kei did not have the courage to fight alone. Looking at the teacher who was wiping the blood on his hands, he thought silently, the rules set by the academy are the most important. This has nothing to do with etiquette. It only shows that there is a guy with the biggest fists in the academy. But who is that guy? The headmaster who drinks wine and cuts peach blossoms. The teacher picked up the book again, looked at Situilan who was still unwilling and said, "Whether you are convinced or not, believe it or not, it is not too late to talk about reason with me when you can break the rules of the academy. As for now, my reason is so simple, etiquette is the rule, and that is my rule. Etiquette is the rule, and that is my rule." What a sonorous, powerful, tyrannical, unreasonable, and insolent declaration. Ning Kei stared at the teacher who was like an old tree trunk, and found that he could not understand what kind of place this academy was, but he liked this damn place more and more. The class ended on time at noon. The teacher of etiquette put an ink scroll under his armpit, blew the long beard on his chin, and walked out of the study room with an extremely arrogant look. The students in the study room were stunned for a moment, and then they all gathered together to talk about the scene in the morning. Situilan and others rushed to the beaten student, took out a clean handkerchief with concern, and began to clean the wound on his face. The burly male student's face was full of tears of grievance. "Chu Zhongtian, you are such a good-for-nothing." Situilan angrily hit his head and scolded, "If your grandfather saw you like this, he would probably die of anger. You don't know shit, but you dared to talk back to the teacher. It's okay to talk back, but don't you know how to fight back when the teacher hits you? Even if you don't fight back, don't you know how to dodge?" Chu Xiongtu, the general of the 16th Guards of the Tang Empire, had 7 sons and 37 grandsons. Chu Zhongtian was the best among his grandsons, or he would not have been admitted to the academy. But because of his family background, Chu Zhongtian still had a strong martial arts. Who would have thought that he would be beaten like a pitiful quail by the teacher? Chu Zhongtian wiped the tears off his face, looked at Situilan, and complained, "Sister Ilan, you really can't blame me for this. According to my grandfather, if someone wants to beat me, I have to fight back, no matter if it's a prince or a prince. I really wanted to fight back, but I don't know why I couldn't move at all." At this moment, Chu Yoxian's lazy voice came from the study room. "Chao Jifeng, the associate professor of etiquette in the academy, graduated from the course of magic skills in the academy in the 7th year of the Tang Empire's Divine Wind. He has been teaching in the academy for more than 30 years, and is a psyche master in the see-through state. Hearing this, everyone in the study room was silent. Situilan opened her eyes wide and stamped her feet angrily after a while. She shouted, "Even if he is a psyche master, why does a cultivator bully a kid?" Chu Yuxian walked up and looked at Chu Zhongtian, who was badly battered. He sighed and shook his head, saying, "You can't argue with him, because Professor Chao Jifeng is from Yen." Ning Ke, who was standing outside the crowd, could not help but shake his head when he heard this answer. He thought to himself, "You really can't argue with him when you mentioned the great victory of the Tang Empire in front of a Yen, and the crown prince of the Tang Empire was taken hostage and beaten up." The Tang Empire dominated the world, and its people were confident and even arrogant. Ning Ke admitted that he often showed some arrogance when he faced the barbarians on the grassland at the frontier fortress. But today, it seemed that the academy in the south of Chang'an was inclusive. Not only the students, but also the teachers came from foreign countries. So he had to be more careful in the future. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.